are seated on... Welcome, and you and your colleague. Are you in a position to proceed on behalf of National Treasury?
We are, sir, yes.
Thank you. That's rather in the way. Yes. Yes, you. Do you need to see the screen while you are presenting? Is that sufficient for you? That's fine. Would you like to go ahead, please, at your convenience?
Thank you, Chairperson.
Just place your name and title on record, please, for the purpose of recording.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm Michael Sachs. I'm the Deputy Director General for the Budget Office at National Treasury. I'm also assisted here by Deputy Director General Dondo Mukojani on my right. He is the DDG responsible for public finance. The Treasury team we have here, I also have Mr. Ian Stewart, who's the Chief Director responsible for fiscal policy, and Ms. Julia Dubrain, who is the Chief Director responsible for the budgets of the higher education and basic education departments.
Thank you for taking the trouble to come and to prepare a presentation.
So today we won't be addressing the issues of higher education directly. Our aim is to give you, the Commission, a context about the fiscal and macroeconomic background and how we do budgeting in the Treasury, so that you understand some of the issues that we face when we have a resource shortfall of the kind that we're confronting here. I think our main message today is that resources and resource constraints are real constraints. And when you have real resource constraints, anything that you do to allocate resources in the system somewhere has consequences somewhere else in the system. So there isn't a place where we can simply pick up resources and allocate them to address a problem without there being a consequence. In the main, and I'm just extemporizing while the presentation returns to the screen, but in the main, if we are to spend more on higher education, for example, we would need to either raise taxes or allocate the additional spending from somewhere else within the system. And one of the great things about the protests that took place last year is that they generated a lot of debate about inefficiencies within the budget system and places within the budget system that we could allocate resources to. But in general, again, there's very few areas of resource allocation where there is resources can be taken without consequences. Wherever we take the resources from, there will be a consequence for that. So I take it that the Commission does have the presentation on paper before them. So
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so I don't need, we'll proceed without the screen. There are 4 parts to the presentation. One is the fiscal policy and macroeconomic context. The next is choices and constraints in last year's budget. The third is taxation and how we should think about the problems of taxation. And lastly, we'll look at the budget process. Turning to slide 4, it's important to note that over the last 2 decades, we've seen an increase in government social spending. Okay. So if I take, for example, the basic education, which is this gray line here, you can see that from in about the year 2000, now this graph is showing us per capita real spending. So we've taken out the impact of inflation, and we've divided the total spending by the population. So in about the year 2000, we were spending 3,000 Rand per South African on education. Since then, that has risen to about 5,000 Rand. So the last year we have data for on this data set is 2012-13. So education expenditure as a whole has risen considerably per South African. Again, you can look at the red line there and see that spending on social protection per South African has risen from below 2,000 to above 3,500 per person in the country. And almost every element of social spending on that graph has seen a sustained increase. The only area where you see a decrease in allocation there, in spending, is interest on debt. And of course, interest on debt is what we have to pay for the deficits that we incurred in the past. And you can see that it declines over the whole period until about 2008-9, and then it begins to increase, because that was the year that we were hit by the global recession, and we were unable to pay for all of our spending, and we had to widen our deficit and accumulate debt.
Mr. Sachs,
Yes.
can you explain for the unknowledgeable what social protection means?
In the main, it's grants. It's the old age grant, the child support grant. Those are the main drivers of that expenditure line in this graph.
Just a follow-up on that. Is it exclusively grants? So does this reside with one department?
There will be some other things in there, such as payments from the Unemployment Insurance Fund and the Road Accident Fund. Julia, I don't know if I've covered it. So it isn't exclusively grants, and it would also include the operational expenditure of the department. It would include payments for social workers. It would include payments for social workers employed in provinces. So there's a wide range of things in there, but I would say 80 to 90% of the spending will be social grants there. So the next graph shows the headline picture. And what you can take from that, the graph starts in 2002, and there's this distinction between consolidated and main budget, which is kind of technical, I won't go into it. But in 2002, government was spending about 12,000 Rand per South African as a whole. So each South African received, in terms of services and goods and services from the state, 12,000 Rand. By 2014-15, that had risen to almost 21,000 Rand. So there's almost a doubling of government spending per South African in the economy. And again, we're taking out the effects of inflation here. These are all in real 2015 Rand.
Is this, does this represent total spending in every respect?
So when we
How's it calculated?
So this is the total budget, the budget announced by the Minister of Finance when he tables in Parliament. So it's everything that is financed from taxes.
Yes.
Let me put it like that. So there is other elements of what we might think of as public spending that are not included here. For example, the spending by Eskom. That is not financed by taxes, it's financed by electricity tariffs. And although it's a state-owned company, it's not part of the budget.
But this is all hard money. This is not just also theoretical money.
This is all actual Rand.
Yes.
That is spent, that is appropriated by Parliament from the National Revenue Fund and spent on health and education, higher education, social services, defense, police, and all of the services that government provides. I should point out that the other major element that is excluded is a large share of local government, because local government, many local governments are funded from taxes, which is included here, but other parts of, so for example, in Johannesburg, the large metros, a large part of their budget is funded from rates and utility charges, and that is their own budget. It's not included in the national budget. So this is the national budget of government. And the message is we've had this almost doubling of spending per person over the last decade or so. Now the dotted parts at the end of those lines are our forecasts, because we have a 3-year budgeting cycle and we forecast 3 years ahead. What are we committing to the next 3 years? And you can see what's happened since the global crisis hit us in 2009. We have stabilized spending. And our main fiscal priority at the moment is to stabilize the level of spending. We're not engaged in a process of reducing our expenditure commitment, but we want to stabilize our level of spending. And the reason we want to do that is because we are worried about the rise of debt. Because since the crisis of 2008, more and more of this spending has been financed by debt. And if debt reaches a particular level, we can easily find ourselves in a position that many others in the world have found themselves in, where you can no longer sustain this high level of spending.
May I just clarify one thing? You said earlier that inflation had been taken out of the figures.
Yes.
Does that mean that the increase that we see is not an inflationary increase?
That's correct, Chairperson.
When you say it's taken out, what do you mean by that?
So we engage in a statistical process called deflation. Basically, we take the number, say, from 2002-3, and we deflate, we take the CPI index. What has been the inflation rate? So let's say CPI was 6% last year, thereabouts. We would increase the spending there last year by 6%, so that in rand terms it's equal to the spending this year.
All right, so these are all real increases then?
Real, yeah.
So the increase from 10,000 to 20, whatever it is, 21,000 is a real increase?
Yeah.
All right.
So if you see on the vertical axis, it says constant 2015 rand. So the rand, of course a rand in 2002 would not buy as much, or would have bought more than a rand buys today.
Yes.
So we've taken out that effect by using the inflation rates, the CPI inflation rates each year. We've taken out that effect. So this is measured in today's rands, basically.
Well, sorry, I don't want to make a fool of myself here, but the increase to 20,000, is that not because it costs more today to pay for something?
No.
No.
That's exactly when we say a real increase, or we're taking out the effect of the slow devaluing of money.
Yes,
we're taking out that effect, the fact that it costs more, and we're dividing by the population. So the fact that the population has also expanded over the period has been taken out of this graph. So we're saying per South African, in real terms, we've almost doubled our expenditure over the last decade. Now, it's important to remember that
is this because of the greater breadth of subject matter that you're spending on?
So what lies behind it, and maybe I should go back to the previous graph, because the previous graph is showing the same thing, but broken down into different policy areas rather than the aggregate.
Yeah.
Just before you continue, Mr. Sachs, if you can just maybe also explain the difference between consolidated and main budget.
Okay. The consolidated budget includes certain items of expenditure that are not appropriated from the National Revenue Fund. In the main, what that means is there's, for example, again, the UIF, which has a source of funding which doesn't go through the national. You pay UIF contributions, and then the UIF pays out benefits when people become unemployed. So the consolidated budget includes the UIF. It includes the Road Accident Fund. It includes public entities like SANRAL and PRASA, whereas the main budget excludes those. So the main budget is the departments of government, national and provincial in the main, as well as some transfers to local government, whereas the consolidated government is a slightly broader measure of state spending. But as you can see in the graph, the difference between the two isn't particularly significant for today's purpose. Yeah. So what lies behind this expansion of spending per person? You can see that a lot of the increases in education. Unfortunately, I don't have the breakdown in this data set between basic and higher education. But put simply, we have, over that period, significantly expanded the employment of teachers. We have significantly expanded the employment of police officers. We have significantly expanded the employment of nurses in hospitals over that period where you see the expenditure rising. We've significantly expanded the recipients of social grants. There's been a wide range of services. If you look at the green line there, you can see that the spending on housing and community amenities has expanded. So what you're seeing here is a real expansion of the size of the state and the extent of services that are provided by the state over the period.
Whereas defense has remained more or less
Defense
stable.
has remained more or less static in this graph. And in certain respects, defense is a good example, in fact. If you look, so these numbers are not the direct, let me not contradict myself, but if you look at the actual budgets that are tabled, defense is a good example of where we reprioritized from one priority to another. Because one of the reasons we were able to expand access to social grants was that we contained and somewhat reduced the amount of defense spending over the period. So one could say that there was a reallocation from defense towards social grants. So coming out of the 1980s and the early 1990s, South Africa had a very large security expenditure. And there was some benefit of scaling that back and shifting the money into social grants. But of course, you can only do that once. And now the Defense Force, I think, is another area of government where you could say it's somewhat underfunded.
On that, interest on debt, what would be debt in this instance?
Can I ask Commissioner that I come back to that question, because in a further slide I'm going to be addressing, I've got a slide on debt. So I want to come to this slide now, slide 5, 6, which shows now spending and revenue. I'm using a different metric here. I've left now the per capita real spending. I'm now talking about as a percent of GDP. So of all of the income of all South Africans, of the whole economy, which is GDP, government in 1996 was spending about 22%. And that red line shows non-interest expenditure. The reason it's non-interest is that we're taking out the payments we make for interest on our debt. So this is the money we allocate for services, for actual things that we buy in the economy. And you can see from 1996 until about the year 2000, there was a reduction in spending as a share of GDP, a reduction in government spending. But then from around 2000, we have the same effect that I've been showing you, a massive increase in spending as government employed more teachers, nurses, and police officers, and improved their conditions of service. As government paid more social grants, increased the value of social grants, lowered the age increased the age that children were able to receive social grants, expanded the net, and improved the value of social grants, increased the number of police officers on the beat and improved their salaries. Through that period from 2000 to about 2010, you had a massive expansion in the size of the state of the economy, from around 20% to around 27% of GDP. And the reason that at the time this seemed like an appropriate thing to do is explained by the black line, which is showing the revenue we receive from taxes as a share of GDP. And you can see in the period from about 2003 to 2008, taxes were extremely buoyant. South Africa was growing then at about 5% of GDP, commodity prices were high, and us, not only us, but the whole world thought that this situation would, to a large extent, continue. So government was of the view that a lot of this buoyant tax revenue would remain in the system, and therefore it made sense to expand our spending up to a new higher level. At the same time, we were reducing some of the tax rates, but we were nevertheless getting more and more revenue. But then we were hit by the crisis in 2008, and you can see the immediate effect of tax collapsing in 2008. For the first time in 2009, we had negative growth in tax, and this huge gap then opened up between the red line and the black line, and between expenditure and revenue. And like a household, if you are spending more than your income, you are funding the difference by borrowing. And this is what happened to us in 2008. And since 2008, we have not been able to close that gap. And so you can see that the gap has begun to close, but almost all the closing of the gap on this graph has been on the revenue side. In other words, the tax burden on South Africans has been rising. Rather than borrow money and pay debt, we've been increasing the burden of taxation from around 23% in 2009 to about 26% today. In the last budget, in the 2015 budget, we increased personal income tax rates. In the last budget, we announced further increases in personal income tax and fuel tax. And you can see again the dotted line. There's a continuation of this commitment to moderate tax increases over the medium term. On the other hand, expenditure, again, and I want to stress this, has been sustained at this high level. And we're not in the business now of reducing the size of the state, cutting back on the size of government, because there are a lot of social needs in society. Our aim is to sustain spending at this level. And unfortunately, in order to do that, you either need to borrow or you need to tax. And you can see quite a large share of the closing of the gap has been on the revenue side already.
Are you going to tell us how this situation compares with the rest of the world? I mean, are you going to tell us whether South Africans are heavily taxed by comparison with the rest of the world or not, sir?
I do have some tables on that.
Will you come to that sort of thing?
I will,
Thank
later
you.
in the presentation,
Yes.
yeah. So the next graph just shows the borrowing. Each year, if you spend more than your income, you borrow. So when it's below zero, the negative, this is the deficit. So you can see in 2006, 2007, although we had expanded the expenditure so dramatically, we had a surplus. In other words, we had more revenue than we needed to spend.
What is a structural deficit?
A structural deficit means that it is a permanent, so that we distinguish between structural and cyclical. In economics, generally people will believe that the economy goes up and down. And as the economy goes up and down, tax revenue also goes up and down. So if your spending is remaining flat and your economic cycle is going up and down and your revenue is going up and down, you'll get a cycle of deficit and then surplus, deficit and then surplus. And that would be a cyclical deficit. And in those conditions, it makes sense to borrow. Because when you go down, you borrow a bit, and then when you come back up, you have enough money to pay back your borrowing. A structural deficit now means we're permanently in this borrowing condition. And you can see from 2009, we went into 6% deficit. So 6% of GDP had to be borrowed to meet government spending commitments. And since then, we've been structural in the sense that it's been stuck at 4%. 3.5 to 4%. It hasn't been moving really. These grey bars are the future. It's yet to happen. It's what we want to do in the budget. But if I had come here 3 years
Mr. Sachs,
ago...
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think you just need to step closer to the mic so that we can record all
If
of
I'd
what
have
you're
come
saying.
here 3 years ago and showed you the same bars, the grey bars would also have been closing. But each year that goes past, they don't close. So each year that goes past, we've had to take more drastic action to try and close those bars.
Is it?
Sorry.
And is it like an overdraft? Permanent overdraft?
It's something like that. It's something like that.
Does the fact that we have had for the last month or two good trade balances portend something good?
It might do. And again, I will come to that in a couple of slides.
Do trade balances affect your budgetary plans?
They affect revenue somewhat. In fact, we get more revenue from imports. But the effect, where we would look for the effect of trade balances is that it may be an indication that growth is improving. Because if our exports are growing, it means maybe the economy is going to pick up. And if the overall economy picks up, it means we will get more revenue.
Sure. Thank you.
So each year, I mean, it maybe comes back to the overdraft question. This graph shows how much you're short each year. So your spending was 100 Rand, but your salary was 80 Rand. So it means that each year you had to borrow 20 Rand. So the first year you borrow 20 Rand, the second year you borrow another 20 Rand, now you owe 40 Rand. Then the following year you owe 60 Rand. So this is showing the stock of debt. How much does government owe to investors, to people who have lent us money? You can see that in 2007, I'm focusing on the grey bars now, we owed, that's 483 billion Rand, right? This year, if you look at 2015-16, or if you look at 2016-17, we expect to be borrowing, we expect to be owing 2,000 billion Rand. That's 2 trillion Rand. Now the total value of all of the income in the South African economy is about 4 trillion Rand. So our debt is now 50% of GDP, and that's what the red line is showing you. The same numbers, but now as a percentage of GDP. And you can see as a percentage of GDP, we have gone from about 20% in 2007 to about 45% today. And again, I want to stress that the dotted lines is what we hope will happen in the future. It hasn't yet happened. What has happened is that debt has continued to rise. Our main fiscal policy objective today is not to reduce debt, but to stabilize the growth of debt. So we want that red line to become a flat line. So we're not really talking about cutting down the amount we owe, but we want to stabilize it. Because if the debt continues to rise, the people who are lending you money start asking the question, when will this stop? And we want to be able to show them that we are able to stop it in order for them to continue lending us the money.
If you increase taxes, do you automatically reduce debt?
If you increase taxes and you don't increase spending, then you can close the deficit. So you stop the growth of debt. But there's another complication, which is the relationship between taxes and economic growth. And so you can raise taxes and also undermine economic growth, which economic growth is the growth of GDP. And GDP is the denominator of this metric of debt to GDP ratio. So if GDP begins to go down, that debt will rise as a share of your income. So now this is the big problem we're also having, is that, again, we're talking about a structural versus a cyclical problem. That this graph is showing economic growth since the year 2000. So the blue bars are just the annual growth of GDP, which is the value of all goods and services produced in the South African economy. It's the value of the income of all South Africans added together. So you can see that national income grew by between 3 and 5%, almost reaching 6% in that period from 2000 until 2008. The average GDP growth rate in that period was about 4.3%. And while that is taking place, while the economy is growing at that rate, the resources available to government are also growing at that rate. Since the global crisis in 2009, you see we had negative growth, the economy contracted in that period. Since 2009, we had a rebound back to 3%, but each year after that, the economic growth in the economy has been slowing and slowing and slowing. This year in the budget in 2016, in February, we estimated that growth for the year would be 0.9%. We will be revising that forecast in October when we present our medium-term budget policy statement. Others, for example, the Reserve Bank, have revised their forecast down to 0% for the current year. So there's a concern, or a lot depends in these budget estimations on what is the long-term average trajectory of the economy. If you think that the long-term average trajectory of the economy is a growth rate of 4.5%, that means government will be able to afford all kinds of things from the growth of the economy, because everything government gets ultimately comes from this economy. So it's like the goose is laying more golden eggs and we're able to take more of them. But if the growth rate in the future is only going to be 2% over the next decade, we're going to have a problem. The National Development Plan, which has a detailed set of recommendations on the expansion of further education and training, assumed that we would achieve a sustained growth rate of around 5%. We are now looking at a growth rate over the last decade of about 2%, and there's growing concern that this 2% will be a permanent condition afflicting us. So of course, the next graph...
Mr. Sachs,
sorry.
how permanent is permanent? Is it perpetuity or?
That's a question economists also always prefer not to answer, but in this context I'm talking about the next 10 to 15 years. So if the NDP has a growth target of 5%, and it also has objectives of raising employment, reducing inequality, reducing poverty by 2030, which is in 15 years' time. So that's the kind of time horizon I'm talking about in permanent terms.
In context, would the finding be different, or the planning in the NDP, if this 2% is confirmed? So it means 5% isn't correct.
Well, I think the NDP was saying if we take certain actions, we will be able to accelerate growth towards 5%. So the NDP is a package, and then one has to ask, I suppose, have we taken those actions? Have we taken the actions as a society necessary to make growth accelerate? Of course, this is not only about South Africa. These are also global phenomena. So when the NDP was drafted during the global boom of the 2000s, global growth was going to be much higher, and globally growth has everybody's, so the US permanent long-term growth rate has also been revised down, for example. So when we prepare our budget, the most important thing, because we have a 3-year budget, the most important thing we look at is what is economic growth going to be over the next 3 years. Because economic growth over the next 3 years will tell you what is revenue that government is going to get over the next 3 years. Now this graph, I'm now on slide 10, shows how we've been disappointed year after year. So the black line is the actual growth rate since about 2005. You see the impact of the global recession in 2009-10, where we had negative growth. Growth then rebounds. Then that first blue line was our forecast of economic growth in the 2014 budget. So we said we expected growth to recover towards 3.5% or 4% over the next 3 years. But if you look at what actually happened, the black line, it went in the opposite direction. And each year, year after year, in successive budgets, we faced the same problem. In the last budget that we presented in February, the growth forecast is given by the green line there. Now, we haven't updated our forecast, but I've also showed you what the latest IMF forecast is, and you can see that it's far from that green line. So, going straight to the next graph, there is a direct relationship between economic growth and revenue growth.
I'm sorry to disturb
no,
you.
that's fine.
I don't know if we got any, what caused the growth in 2010? On the previous graph, yeah?
So the main impact in 2010 was the global economic recession. So you remember we had, well, it was 2009 and 10. That's the year where you have negative growth. There was a worldwide recession in that year.
And then it goes up again?
And then there's a rebound up to 3%, which is often the case when you have a recession. Because, I mean, in economics, it's almost like whatever goes down must come up. It's like things go... You see, if we'd have had that recession in 2008, 9, 10, and then we'd returned to 3% and stayed there, we wouldn't be having a large problem. Because as I said, that would have been a cyclical departure, a temporary departure from the norm. And then we would have recovered, and our revenue would have recovered, and we would have been on track where we were before. The problem is we recovered, and then we're going down and down and down, and we're now thinking we're at this permanently lower growth rate. And if we're at a permanently lower growth rate, it means our revenue income is going to be permanently lower. And that means we have to now look at our expenditure. It's like a household. If you lose your job, but you know that next year you will get another job, it might make sense for you to borrow now to sustain your lifestyle in this interim period. But if you lose your job permanently and your income is permanently lower, it doesn't make sense for you to continue borrowing, because all you're doing is postponing the reality that you're going to have to reduce your expenditure to this new lower level of income that you have. And this is really the challenge that we're facing now.
May I just ask you, why is it that your budgetary forecasts are so far from reality?
You know, it's a funny thing that I'm coming here and admitting how bad we are at forecasting in a sense.
No, not at all. I don't think it's funny at all. There must be reasons. I would know the reasons.
So what I will say is that our forecasts are not substantially different from everybody else's. That's the best answer that I can give you.
That may be, but why are they out? What is causing this annual inability to get close to the truth?
So I think when I say everybody else's, so if you look at the forecast for global growth, that's the world economy, given by the IMF, you would see the same pattern. Now, when we prepare our forecasts, you have to make assumptions. So one of the main assumptions we make is, what is the global economy growth going to be? So we assume that the global economy is going to grow at 3%. That has an impact on our exports, because if global income is growing, they're demanding more from us. So that goes into our model, and we make that assumption. But then the IMF is wrong. and global economic growth is much lower than that. So there's a global aspect that throughout the world there's been a same experience of declining, but there are also domestic factors at play. So there are a lot of reforms that I think are recommended in the NDP that have not been executed with the speed that are necessary to accelerate growth in the South African economy. I don't know, Mr. Mokojane, you want to add anything on that?
I mean, if you look at global growth, and in particular look at emerging economies.
Sorry, Mr. Mokhonjali, I'm sorry to interrupt you. If you can just put yourself on record and then proceed to address the
I'm
Commission.
Dondo Mokhajan. I'm Deputy Director General responsible for public finance in the National Treasury. I was saying, Chairperson, that it's important to note that, for instance, if we talk about global growth, we also based our assumptions on what's happening in emerging economies, in particular if we look at China and India and the growth there. China and India, at some point they were growing at around 10, 11, 12%, India at around 7, 8, 9% at the time. Now, the amount of exports to China, as an example, raw materials, steel, iron ore, also that has got an impact in terms of our own forecast. Now, if China's economy slows down, and China's economy is big as the US, if it slows down, it effectively also means that our exports to China slows down, and that has got a direct impact on growth. Again, if you think about our own mining sector, during the commodity boom periods, when our exports, platinum prices were high, gold prices were high, we were exporting, and that had direct impact on growth. As an example, but just one incident, as an example of the Marikana massacre and challenges, that in itself had an impact in the mining sector, in platinum in particular. And then as a result, there was slow commodity prices and slow production, output production in terms of exports, and that had a direct impact. So each and every of the forecasts that you make, they're informed by various factors. And there are some other challenges internally that we have, as Michael says, doing things that the NDP says we must do, and we're not doing them very well, and then we've got other challenges in various other sectors that should boost economy, our agriculture, and its performance, etc.
I hear
That's
all
good.
of that, but it doesn't really tell me why your forecasts are so bad. Because if you're forecasting knowing that these are problems and are likely to be problems each year, I don't know why the gap should be so large.
Just to add on that, somewhere the factors which you take into account in doing your forecasts, one would think that after 2 years of you being out in your forecast, you then start reviewing how you forecast. And this happens across the world, except, well, all things being equal, it doesn't happen that way. But one would have expected that you would adjust your factors you take into account in coming to a forecast.
Otherwise, you may as well be working for the Weather Bureau.
Well, it's usually an analogy that I use, which it is a lot like weather forecasting, in fact, because nobody knows.
Sorry to hear it.
Yeah, nobody actually knows what the future holds. That's the truth. And economists, so when I say if I took the forecast of a private bank, and remember, a private bank is in this to make money, and their economic forecasts will determine their own business strategy. A private bank in South Africa would have the same record as us. Our record is not worse than anyone else's. So it's a problem with economics rather than a problem with National Treasury. I would put it like that. We have revised our forecast down. If you see the blue line, as I said, the blue line, which was budget 2014, we thought then that we would rebound towards 3.5%. When we came to budget 2015, which is the red line, we said maybe that was too optimistic. Our outer year, the furthest out forecast, is now below 3%. In the budget of February this year, we expected a rebound of to 2.5%. I don't think there's anyone, I think everyone would still agree that assuming that the IMF projection there is right, and this year's growth is 0%, everyone would agree that that's not where we're going to be permanently. That at some point this thing is going to turn around and the economy is going to come back and grow faster than this 0% that is being projected now.
Does that mean that this is all really cyclical and not structural?
Well, look, there's a cyclical and a structural element. So if I go back to this picture. So we're saying, in a sense, if you regard the red line as the structural path of growth, and the blue bars as the cycle around that structure. So I'm saying everyone agrees that the structural rate of growth now is higher than 0, but it's probably not 4%. The Reserve Bank currently estimates that it's around 1.5%. So the structural growth has come down, but in addition, we're now even well below that. There's also a cyclical downturn.
All right, thank you. I think I've distracted you from where you were going.
Okay. Now, this, I won't go into this, but you can look at it on your leisure. It just shows the growth of government's revenue and the growth of the economy. Note that this is nominal growth, so it includes prices, which is why the numbers are slightly different, but that's not really significant. The point is, when growth is lower than we expect, the immediate consequences is that revenue is lower than we expect. So, all of this is background, I suppose, to this conclusion, which I'll just go through briefly. The medium-term framework, which is our budget over the next 3 years, sustains the social gains. So those social gains I'm talking about is what I showed you in the first graphs of the huge expansion of social spending. It sustains social gains in a weakening economic environment. And according to our estimations, the current level of spending is sustainable if economic growth returns to its historic average. And that historic average, if you look over 100 years, is about 3 or 3.5%. However, if 2% growth is a new normal, a stable debt path will be difficult to sustain in the long run, even with current levels of expenditure. So in other words, if growth is permanently lower, our revenue is going to be permanently lower, and our revenue isn't going to catch up with our level of expenditure, and debt is going to continue to grow and is never going to reach that flat line that we're hoping it's going to reach. And that's the case even if we don't take 2 new policy initiatives. This is just to finance what we're currently spending on, right? Now, there are several new policy initiatives on the table, and the purpose today is not to go into the higher education issues, but in the National Development Plan, one of those is the expansion of higher education, tertiary education. We estimate that over the next 15 years, that could cost anything between 2 to 3% of GDP in additional spending. And we'll come back when we do our main submission on the basis of that estimation.
Not annually, 2 to 3%?
Yeah, annually.
Annually,
Yeah.
thank you.
So it's an additional annual expenditure of 2 to 3% of GDP. The national health insurance...
Is this, that is all education, is it not just
No,
higher
that's
education?
tertiary education. That
Tertiary
is the
education.
expansion of the system of the post-school education and training system.
No, I hear you, because but I'm thinking immediately, well, our present expenditure on education to GDP is 0.75% or thereabouts.
That's tertiary education.
That's right.
So I'm not including basic education, high schools and primary schools,
I
etc.
understand that, but now you say that it's going to go up to 2%.
Yeah. 2 to 3% of GDP additional expenditure.
On tertiary education.
Yeah. But we'll come, Chairperson, to the actual estimates later on. But those are our preliminary estimates of the cost of what is in the National Development Plan.
Yes, well, you may in due course explain to us how you come to that sort of figure.
We will
yes,
do so.
thank you.
Yeah. So we've looked at also the costing of the national health insurance. And national health insurance, again, it's very difficult to cost, but our estimate is between 2 and 3% of GDP. So if you add just those two things together, you're looking at an expansion of spending of around 5% of GDP. Now, there's nowhere where it would make sense to finance that by borrowing, because this is recurring consumption expenditure. It's for salaries and things like that. So it wouldn't make sense. So either you need to reallocate that 5% of GDP from somewhere else in the spending system, or you need to raise taxes by 5% of GDP.
Bring in a new source of revenue.
You need a new source of revenue, or you raise the existing taxes by 5% of GDP. So we say there that in order to achieve these things, we're not, our purpose here, and I think we're very clear about it, we're not saying things can't be done. It can be done. And in many other societies it has been done. But we need to understand what are the consequences of those choices. If we have to raise taxes by 5% of GDP, it's not something that we should do. It's something that we should approach with great care and thought, is our message. Similarly, there are many suggestions within, coming from the public and coming from students and coming from many people with good intentions about where within the existing budget, how we can improve efficiency within the existing budget to fund these elements. And there are certainly many efficiencies that we can find in this existing budget. But when you add them all together, it's highly unlikely that it's going to reach anywhere near the kind of quantum of expenditure that is being put on the table.
Mr. Sachs, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to confirm, at the moment, that the quantum of expenditure which you're addressing is the NDP targets.
Yes.
It's not the fees must fall demand.
Yes, I think so, yeah.
That's right, yeah.
Julia, want to add anything?
Would the satisfaction of the NDP targets on education also represent a satisfaction of the fees must fall?
Not necessarily, because so the NDP target, really what we're looking at is a significant expansion of enrollment in the university sector and in the technical and vocational education and training sector, and in the latter in particular. I don't know, Julia, if you want to...
Well, it may be that both of those are consistent with the fees must fall. I'm not sure.
So if you were to say the whole thing is free,
Yes.
we haven't, that's not part of what we're suggesting here. We're simply saying to implement the NDP. So I think a lot of the discussion over the last few years before the fees must fall events was that the Department of Government has a white paper on post-school education and training. If you look at that paper, there's very little detail on the cost of the proposals and the funding of that cost. And immediately we initiated a process together with the Department of Higher Education and Training to say, let's sit down and look at how much is this going to cost and what are the options of funding it. And we prepared quite a detailed set of reports that look at exactly that question. And this was before the fees must fall thing emerged. And I think those reports, or our submission is kind of a summary of those reports that we've worked on together.
Thank you.
You want to say anything, Julia?
Mr. Sachs, just before that, I take it those reports would be available to the team as
Indeed.
part of our deliberations on this question.
Indeed, they will be. So let me reiterate my basic message, that over the last 20 years, government significantly expanded service delivery across a broad range of fronts, where our aim, our main fiscal priority now is to sustain that level of service delivery and not find ourselves in a position where we have to reverse it. Many countries have sustained service delivery by borrowing, and then they found themselves in a painful position of having to go into reverse gear. This happened to many African countries in the 1980s, and you've seen it happen to many European countries today. We don't want to find ourselves in the same position, so we want to stabilize our debt level so that we can sustain the current level of expenditure. However, if economic growth is reduced, in other words, if our permanent income as South Africans is reduced, it's going to be difficult to sustain the current level of expenditure. And that's even before you talk about these expansions and new policy agendas that are on the table and do need to be addressed. So if we add on those new policy initiatives, we will need to look at some combination of those three elements that I mentioned in that slide. Either we need a significant acceleration of economic growth, or we need an increase in the structural level of taxation, which again, I mean the permanent tax level, or we need to shift resources away from other priorities. And there's no other priority that you can shift resources away from that it will be painless to do so. It will have consequences. So with your permission, Chairperson, I know my time might be running out, and I was hoping to accelerate my pace a bit through now looking at what did we do in the last budget.
Excuse me, Amanda. Is the department's time running out?
I think we do have a fair amount of time left,
So
Chairperson.
we can budget for an extra.
We can budget for a little more time, yes.
How much longer? above what they've been allocated?
I think probably about, we're just confirming with another stakeholder, but at the moment it's probably about half an hour.
Well, perhaps you can take a bit more than that too if
Okay.
you need it.
I'm at your pleasure, Chairperson.
No, we really need to get a proper input.
Good.
We just, before, Mr. Sachs, I wanted to check, you were going to come to debt. Is debt, for the purpose of this presentation, the borrowings you're referring to,
Yeah,
or
exactly.
is it something else?
So when I spoke to this graph, that's the amount that we owe. So we now owe 2 trillion rand.
On borrowing?
Yeah, that's how much.
Only, or, so what would be your interest in debt then?
Also, the interest we pay each year is about 160 billion rand. So the interest we pay on debt at the moment is more than we pay for the higher education sector. And rising. And it's the fastest element of spending, and I will come back to that as well.
Sorry, Ms. Pillay, supposing we're not going to have one or more of our later contributors, is it not possible when we reach an appropriate time that this presentation could stand down and recommence when we do have time later in the day?
Chairperson, we're just waiting for confirmation, but it's unlikely that our second presenter will come in today, in which event then we have the spare slot for National Treasury to take. We're just
Could you
waiting
make
for final
yourselves available
confirmation.
later in the day if need be?
We are available, or I am available. I'm not sure if all of my colleagues will be, but I will certainly be
Thank you.
available.
Yes, thank you.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Pillay.
Okay, so and the reason we're going into budget 2016, the budget we announced in February, is obviously that budget was drafted in the context of the fees must fall movement emerging. So we just want to give you a taste of some of the challenges that we faced in that
Well, how
context.
do you, when you say it's drafted in the context, what does that mean literally? That you take into account the implications that you knew at that stage of the fees must fall?
So practically, a decision was taken in December that there would be a 0 fee increase.
Yes.
And that resulted in us having to find 16 billion rand within the system to finance that.
Yes. And you do not look beyond the end of your budgetary period to say...
So we're just looking, now at the impact over, that 16 billion is over the next 3 years. So it's the impact so it was filling the hole that emerged in the university's balance sheets as a result of this 0 fee increase over a 3-year period.
Thank you.
So the first thing to note about the context of the 2016 budget is that in the 2015 budget, we have a rolling budget process, so we prepare 3 years ahead. And in the 2015 budget, we had set aside 60 billion rand for new policy proposals. And our idea was exactly to address the kind of issues that I've been discussing: national health insurance, the expansion of tertiary education, and others. We set aside that 60 billion rand on the assumption that there would be a wage agreement in the public service that would be aligned with inflation. In other words, public servants would get an inflationary increase in their salary. At the time, we didn't know what the increase would be because the negotiations were not concluded yet. That was in February of 2015. So we put 60 billion rand on the table that is not allocated to any department, that we say, this money we need to consider how we're going to spend it in the future years, on which policy priorities. In May, a few months later, we reached an agreement with public servants that meant a effective 10% increase in their salaries during 2016-17, which is CPI plus 4 for that year, plus an effective CPI plus 2 for the next 2 years of the medium term. So that immediately meant that the entire 60 billion we had set aside for new policy priorities was no longer there because it had to go into salaries of public servants. So that was the first challenge we faced in preparing the 2016 budget. Then, as I've already gone into quite a lot of detail on this, economic growth declined. So if I just take the 1 year, 2015-16, in budget 2015, in February 2015, we estimated, and this isn't a far ahead forecast, this is the forecast for the current year that we were working on. We said we think it's going to be 2% in February. By the time we came to October 2015, we'd revised our forecast down to 1.2%. When we came to budget of the following February, the estimate, and this is at the end of the year, the estimate was 0.9, and now we're probably going to revise that down again. So we're faced in the, usually, and this isn't a normal, this isn't how things are supposed to be. Normally, our projections have been pretty much spot on. And I mean, it's particularly for the current year. It's only in the last few years, I would say since the Marikana tragedy, that we've had this year after year, in-year adjustment and had to say, well, what we said 3 months ago, it looks like it's not going to materialize. At the same time, inflation was going up because the exchange rate was depreciating. So you had a huge depreciation of the rand, which again was unexpected. And inflation, if you can see, our first estimate was for 4.8 and it went up to 5.4. Now, if you've just agreed to pay public servants CPI plus 4, that plus, the plus 4 stays fixed, but what CPI is going up, is taking even more. So even after we've taken the 60 billion that we had hoped to set aside and put it into salaries, we still needed more for salaries. And it's not only salaries, we then have to think about social grants for children and for old people. What increment in the value, if it's going to keep pace with consumer price inflation. So we were hit with that. Then the implication was that gross tax revenue was revised down by 11.6 billion. Then we present the MTBPS with all of our nice plans, but on the day we presented the MTBPS, we had students outside of Parliament, and we were sitting in Parliament hearing some noises going on outside, and that process ended up in a zero-fee increment and us having to then find another 16 billion to fund universities over the 3 years. And of course, all of this is happening under heightened scrutiny from ratings agencies. So ratings agencies to a country are like credit bureaus to an individual. You don't necessarily like them, but you know that if they give you a bad opinion, it's going to cause you a problem because you won't be able to borrow money. So the ratings agencies are looking at our fiscal position and looking at all of this and threatening to downgrade us to sub-investment grade, which means that the debt that 2 trillion rand that we've borrowed, the interest rate we will pay on that debt will increase if that happens. So what did we do? First of all, we undertook tax measures. We raised an additional 7.6 billion in the current year, that is, from personal income tax through fiscal drag, which I won't go into the technical details of. We raised 9.5 billion through increases in the fuel levy and specific excise duties. We raised another 2 billion from adjustments to capital gains tax and transfer duty. We also said this is not the end of it. Next year we will be raising taxes again by 15 billion, and the year after that we will raise taxes by 15 billion. So effectively what you've had is in 2015 a 15 billion rand tax increase because we increased the PIT rate in that year. In 2016 we've had another 15 to 16 billion rand tax increase. In 2017 we will have another one, and in 2018 we will have another one. And that's assuming that our forecasts are right, which they might not be. So that was the first action we did. Secondly, we reduced our...
You apparently don't find it too deleterious to the economy to provide for those tax increases.
So that's an excellent question, Chairperson, and it's the big dilemma we face, is that, you know, we have a deficit, we've made a commitment that we will not borrow beyond a certain amount. The economy is not performing well. We then are faced with the situation, do we A, leave the deficit? In other words, the revenue is lower than we had expected because the economy is not performing well. And so it means the deficit is going to be wider, the borrowing is going to be wider. Do we accept that situation and leave it? If we do, the strong likelihood is that we will have our ratings downgraded. If we have our ratings downgraded, the interest rate will rise. Not only for government, but for the whole economy. And that will have a deleterious effect on the economy. On the other hand, if we take action to close that deficit and meet our commitments, there's two things we can do. We can either reduce spending or we can raise taxes. And so this is not, to be quite frank, this is more of an art than a science in the current year. That you have to take a balance of evidence approach.
No, well, I'm sure you know all the ins and outs of these things. But there are countries in the world where there's a 50% income tax rate, yes, are there not?
There are, yeah.
Successful countries.
There are. I will come back to that, time permitting.
So all of these sorts of things are on the table and must be considered every time, and you no doubt weigh them up and decide what
Exactly.
the pros and cons
Yeah,
are.
exactly.
Yes, all right.
And this, that's why I'm genuinely, it's a very difficult question that we confront, and we will confront again the current year. Because if growth does turn out to be zero and we miss our deficit targets again, where's the balance between...
Are we talking about bad fiscal policy, or are we talking about failure to bite the political bullet?
With your permission, Chairperson, I will avoid answering that question directly.
That's what I was afraid of. Yeah.
But what, Chairperson, what's also important, maybe I can expand on the list, by the way, of options available. Countries like Japan, for instance, they even go up to 200% of debt to GDP ratio.
Yes.
You know, 120. We are among the lowest in emerging economies at around 45%, and we want to stabilize at that point.
I understand.
Nothing, however, stops us from going beyond. But however, they affect us. I mean, rating agencies always caution us. And what they also look for, and any other bond investor who buys, people who buy our bonds on a weekly basis, our ability to pay as a country is key for them, to pay back what we owe. So you can go and increase your, but if your ability to pay is questionable, and that talks to the issues that I think correctly so Michael says we cannot go into at this point, it then makes it difficult in an environment where bond investors, where rating agencies are questioning certain decisions that this country takes that in their own view have got a possibility to actually point us to the on a downward spiral. So I think it's important to know that we could have options either to increase tax or to increase our debt to GDP ratio, and because other view out there is that it's very low. But however, the ability of this investor who's buying our bonds to say, will you be able to pay in the next few years, is key for them. And that's why we think at 45%, they are comfortable currently, as per what the rating agencies are. And I think we are also comfortable that if it stabilizes at the level as per one of the slides, around 45 or so, then we think we are on the right track for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
I should also mention, when we consider the balance between spending and revenue measures, there's a growth implication for both. So a lot will depend on which revenue measures. So we also consider that on the growth side, and I'll come back to that a bit. But there's an equity dimension in that most spending goes to the poorer sections of the population. And obviously, I'll be the first to admit that there are inefficiencies in our system. But if you look at social grants, what we spend on health, what we spend on education, the recipients of these goods and services are poorer. Whereas most taxation is felt by the more wealthy sections of the population. So you've got to balance both the growth and the equity considerations in this. Okay.
That's a political decision, or is it a financial decision?
It's both. I mean, budgeting is political, by the way. I mean, I think ultimately we make recommendations, and we have to make recommendations to politicians.
Yes, and they want a national
so we have to take account of these things.
They want a national health scheme. That's how you're done, naturally. Yes.
So the first thing we did was spending measures. Well, sorry, tax measures there. But secondly, we also said we will reduce spending. But we won't reduce spending in the current year in 16-17. We will reduce spending in 17-18 and 18-19 in the future 2 years of our medium-term framework. And we did that by lowering compensation budgets. So across the system, we have taken 10 billion and 15 billion out of compensation budgets of government, the salaries of public servants, in the future 2 years. And even though we've signed this wage agreement with the public servants, the implications of that is that government will have to moderate the number of people it employs over the next couple of years. Because we can't, the salary adjustments are built into a collective agreement. There's no question of us walking away from that. So the only option we have is to moderate the headcounts of public servants. And in the main, that will take place through attrition and is already happening to a large extent. So we say that departments will have to align their human resource plans within these lower limits. The reason we also wanted to do the spending cuts in the future rather than now is that it's always better to get to have preparation. So if you know you're going to have to reduce your headcount, it's better that you do it next year and you know well in advance what's going to happen, because otherwise you make decisions that permanently damage the system.
Does this imply greater unemployment?
The main driver of employment growth over the last 10 years has been the public sector.
Yes.
So this implies a slowdown probably of growth of total employment in the economy, which implies greater unemployment. It's likely to mean that.
Yes, all right.
The third thing we had to do is reprioritization. So in addition to these tax measures and the spending, we had to find 32 billion over the 3 years. Half of that was for higher education, and I'll just come straight to how we did that. So the table on the top, I know maybe the numbers are a little bit small, but the table on the top shows what we reprioritized to. In other words, we allocated in the top line to higher education 4.8 billion in the current year, 5.5 billion next year, and 5.8 billion the year after, to a total of 16.3 billion.
I'm sorry, is this just new allocations?
This is a new allocation
Yes.
to cover the impact of the zero fee increase and address shortfalls in NSFAS. Am I right? Yeah.
Does this imply that you are also budgeting for a zero fee increase next year? Or is this simply spreading this zero fee increase over 3 years?
This was responding to this fee increase over 3 years, the last year. For the current year, or what will be decided this year, we have not budgeted for a zero fee increase.
I see. Now, if you were to do so, it would mean that you would multiply the figures that you've got.
Yes.
And I see. Right here.
The numbers that you see, Chairperson, 4.8, 5.5, and 5.8, effectively covers the carry-through cost of what you would have paid in year one.
Right.
So because we have to sustain that cost throughout the 3 years, and that's what we did here, not taking into account the zero fee increase.
Because from the university's point of view, if they were going to get 50,000 this year, and that was going to increase to 60,000, now it's staying at 50,000. So it will only increase, so the thing carries through permanently. It's a lower base that carries through. You have to pay them permanently more for each zero fee increase you have. I mean, and as an aside, let me say that whatever one's views on free higher education for all, if we were all to agree that that's exactly what we want, the way to do it would not be through zero fee increases. We would find a different mechanism to implement it, because through a kind of unplanned, because it's like a brute mechanism that affects everybody at the same time and interferes with our planning process. But that's kind of an aside.
Are you suggesting you would find a way?
I'm saying if society agreed and if everybody agreed, it would be certainly our job to find a way. Yes.
Of course it would.
And then we would find a different way from a continuous kind of, we're not sure what the fee increase of this year is going to be, and that kind of thing.
That would probably be for another presentation.
Indeed.
And we hope it will be.
Indeed. So the other big spending item that we included, that we had to find money for, is the new development bank, or the BRICS Bank. Part of the reason that spending ballooned so much is that that's something we have to pay in dollars, and the rand depreciated considerably, and you had big amounts there. So, and the others are quite small amounts.
What purpose does the new development bank serve?
Sorry?
What purpose does the new development bank serve?
It is a bank that has been established by an international agreement between South Africa, China, India, and Brazil, and it will fund infrastructure, developmental infrastructure investments. Hopefully, a significant number of them will be in South Africa.
Okay. All right. Yes.
So that's where the money went to, and if you add it all up, it goes to 31 billion rand.
Yes.
And then the table below shows where the money came from. In other words, this is the budgets that we had to cut to fund these issues. So, and we've divided it between national government, provincial government, and local government. So we cut the compensation of employees' budgets of national departments by 1.4, 2.9 and 2.7 billion rand.
So that effectively says to the department, you have 200 staff next year instead of 250.
You could read it like that. So, and this is in addition to the 10 and 15 billion that I mentioned in the previous slide. So it means, what that means is effectively that the police, for example, all of these things, when you get into the details, are more complex. So the police obviously have people who are leaving the force and people who are coming into the force on a continuous basis. There's a churn. But what it says is there will be less resources to expand the police force over the next 3 years.
So to some extent it will be fewer posts, but also it will be not replacing
Exactly.
people who leave. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes, all right.
We then cut goods and services. So these are all things that, it's a highly diverse group of things that government buys to do its work. We cut transfers to public entities. So public entities are things like SARS, the Human Sciences Research Council. There's 200 or so public entities.
SAA.
No, SAA is a public company, so that's outside the budget, hopefully. We prefer it like that.
Just on that, Mr. Sachs, on compensation of employees, I'm just comparing that with economic growth. How did you achieve the cutting down? Unemployment, was it retirement age, or?
So in general, what has happened is that provinces, if you look at some of the data coming out recently, provinces are reducing their employment levels mainly through attrition. So it's what Chairperson indicated. When somebody retires or resigns or moves on or for whatever reason leaves their post, you don't replace the person.
Not actual cutting down of the currently employed.
So that is a kind of cutting down of the currently employed, or it's a cutting down of the but we're not, there haven't been large retrenchments, if I can put it like that.
What we have done, we said to departments, come up with human resource business plans in preparing your 17, 18 budget? 17-18 budget, because that's when effectively the cut is going to start into 18-19. So at the moment, because of this current budget cycle or budget process cycle that we're in, that's the current kind of conversation we're having currently with departments to actually tease them out around how they are going to remain within budget, because the budget is set and it's a reduced budget. So we have to find a mechanism for them to fit within that lower budget. And then we're saying you've got current tools that are in the system that are applicable, attrition has to be taken into account, etc., and not fill new positions. If you had vacancies that were funded, then you don't fill them. And that's why now of late you see very few government posts coming through to be filled in most government departments, because we see a slow response by government departments to actually the personnel numbers as we see them in the current budget.
May I just ask, the transfers to public entities, would government departments be included in that? And for example, DHET, would there have been less transfers to them?
No, they would not be included. So maybe the SETAs would be included. No, the SETAs would not be included because they're funded directly from. So public entities, look, there are many. As I say, there are 200. Like the Bloemfontein Museum is a public entity. The South African Revenue Service is a public entity. South African National Roads Agency is a public entity. What are other good examples of public entities? The National Health Laboratory Services. So it's a hugely diverse set of agencies that are not core government departments, but are set up as an independent legal person, if I can put it like, if that's the right legal term, outside of government, but wholly financed from the fiscus. So the main difference between a public entity and a public company is that a public company like Eskom, Transnet or SAA are financed from their own revenue source, whether it's electricity charges or selling airplane tickets, whereas a public entity is entirely financed by a transfer from the tax base.
So this reprioritization means that you have a large number of unhappy people.
Indeed.
As with the road accident fund.
The road accident fund is in a slightly different category. So that was because they get funded directly. They do get funded from the fiscus, but there's a specific levy on fuel that goes directly into the road accident fund. They're similar to the unemployment insurance fund. That there's a specific earmarked tax, which I'm actually going to come back to later as well, if time permits.
Thank you.
So just to note that if you look at the provincial line, provincial government, we made large cuts to the provincial equitable share. That is the money that is used primarily for health and basic education by provinces. That's the main intention of that
Does
money.
that say both to provincial government and later to local government, you must find your own ways of raising money?
Well, provincial... You want
No, not necessarily. What we said to them, we said we're giving you tools, and then we are stringent. Even from 2013, if members remember, we introduced what was then basically cost containment measures, and we're saying cut on the number of flights that you cut on the number of overseas trips, cut on the and that category. We think they should be within that. They should be able to find some resources to reprioritize, and so it was a package of both cutting and saying, let's make cost containment measures more stringent to ensure that you actually stretch the rent that you have as a department.
Okay, so you have a provincial and a local equitable share. The provincial equitable share finances the core business of the province, which is mainly health and education. The local equitable share is intended to fund free basic services for the poorest South Africans, free basic electricity and free basic water. So we had to shave off a bit from that. The conditional grants, provincial conditional grants and local conditional grants, largely finance infrastructure spending in poor communities. So it's your health, it's your schools, building, your municipal infrastructure, water infrastructure, roads and that kind of stuff, right? Am I right? So just to give you an indication that I think as the chairperson put it, this makes a lot of people unhappy. And we would rather not be in a position where, in an unplanned way, we have to cut, because all of these things are vital things that we would rather do than not do. And when we're placed in a position where we have to shift the money, we have no choice, but we would rather not be there. The next...
I'm sorry, that baseline reductions, that's not the sum of everything that's gone before. What is that? I don't really see it. It could be Vaseline for all I can see.
So when we talk about the baseline, we mean essentially the money that has already been allocated to you in a previous budget. So we allocate to you a baseline, meaning you're going to get 100 Rand this year, 120 Rand next year, 130 Rand the following year. That's your baseline. It's like you have some certainty that you're going to get that money. We then come back and say, there's a problem in higher education, we'll have to reduce your baseline by 2 Rand each of those years. So instead of getting 120 Rand next year, you're going to get 118 Rand.
But that 11 billion is in addition to all the other cuts.
So no, this 11 billion is the total for 16-17.
Well, it's certainly not the total of what is above it.
So we have subtotals there. So
I see.
Yeah, so national government
I see.
subtotal and yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. And it adds up, if you look at the table above, it's not exactly the same, but it's more or less what we, because
Yes, I see.
there was a difference that we just put into the deficit.
Yes.
But it funds that 11.8 billion additional spending is funded by an 11.8 billion cut in spending elsewhere.
I see. Thank you.
So the next slide, I think unless there's any questions, is just to give you, in 1 year, this is the consolidated spending, the total spending. I would point out debt service costs. So for every Rand we collect in revenue, we have to spend about 10 cents just to pay interest for the debt we've accumulated previously. The next slide shows you the growth of expenditure items over the next 3 years according to our plans, and the growth over the last 3 years according to the outcomes of the budget. And I'll point out 2 things. Firstly, note that debt service cost is the fastest growing item of expenditure. And this is something we have no control about. It entirely depends on how much we borrow and the interest rate. Secondly, if you look at post-school education...
Sorry, just on that, can it not be controlled on agreements? Or do you have not an option on interest?
In general, we don't. We borrow by issuing bonds. And the bond is a promise to pay a certain interest rate over a period. There are 2 types of bond. It's fixed interest and inflation. And it's like our word is our bond. Let's put it like that. If we were to ask for some kind of agreement, as you're suggesting, that would be regarded as a debt default. we would be finding ourselves in a position like Greece. So it's something that you would want to avoid at all costs, in fact, because once you do that, then people who want to lend you money say, but you lend these people money today, tomorrow they come and they say, can we renegotiate the terms, so that it would disrupt the whole fiscal operation. So that is something that would indicate a crisis in the country.
But my main query is who you borrow from. Is it not an option that, oh, this one charges more interest, this one doesn't charge a lot? Do you have that option?
So as I say, we don't borrow from individual institutions or banks or so. We borrow by issuing bonds, so we decide we're going to issue a bond. It's a 20-year bond. In other words, we're going to pay you back the money in 20 years' time. And the face value of the bond is 1 billion rand. And between now and 20 years' time, we will pay you 10 million rand every year. That's the coupon, what they call on the bond. So that's a piece of paper that then you sell to the person, and the person gives you 1 billion rand. Then that person has the piece of paper, and they can sell it to anyone else they want for different values. So it's one of the great advantages South Africa has is a bond market. So most developing countries don't have a bond market, at least not in their own currency. So we are able to borrow through bonds in rands, which means we can sustain this level of borrowing. Other people are forced to go to banks, or other countries to go to banks and borrow in dollars. And it's a very dangerous thing, because then when your currency depreciates, suddenly you can't pay your debt anymore. So yeah, the bond market is as we say, we issue about 10 billion rand in debt every week. Every week, right?
Every week.
Or is it every week? So we're borrowing continuously through this, issuing these pieces of paper, which
Maybe
is like
if
an
you
IOU.
educate me on that, and then when you're issuing bonds, does it say that the interest payable on this is this?
Yeah.
Is how much? So it's a standard figure that you can't work
Well,
around.
it's like you're selling something, so you say we're going to pay this much, and then people decide whether to buy it or not. And if if the amount that you've said is not to people's appetite for buying, because people who are buying those bonds are banks and internet, and they can buy bonds from it. They can buy bonds from the U.S. Treasury. They can buy bonds from the British Treasury. So you have to set an interest rate that's going to be attractive in the market. So it's that kind of interplay between supply and demand in the market for this debt. Okay. So this graph is so then once you've issued these bonds, then you have to pay the interest. And the point of this graph is that over the next 3 years, the interest payments on debt is growing at 11% or 12%. Oh, sorry, my mistake. Yeah, 11.4% per annum over the next 3 years. Over the last 3 years, the interest on debt grew at 11.6. So it's coming down a bit because we're borrowing a bit less because of our efforts to close the gap. But now, if you look at, I just want to draw your attention to post-school education. That the grey bar, which is the last 3 years, shows that post-school education, apart from debt service costs, was the fastest growing item of expenditure. And over the next 3 years...
Does that include the effect of the no fee increase?
So the grey bar is the last 3 years, not including it.
Yeah.
The red bar is the next 3 years, which includes it.
I see.
But what's important to understand is that that is not universities alone. That includes the SETAs, the money that is coming from the skills development levy, which from our point of view as Treasury is an in and an out, because the skills development levy comes from, it's a payroll tax, so when you employ somebody, you pay 1% of your total salary bill over in the skills development levy, and it goes directly to the Department of Higher Education and Training. And they use it, and then it goes directly to two things: the SETAs, the Sector Education and Training Authorities, and what is called the National Skills Fund. So those fast growth rates aren't necessarily the growth in transfers to universities. It's the average of the whole sector, which includes the transfers to universities and the money coming from the skills development levy, which has been growing very fast.
Well, can you just enlighten me very quickly on this? The money in the SETAs, Are you building up a huge reservoir which is available for use somewhere or another and which is being siphoned off for use in various directions? Or are you building something that comes in and goes out at an equal level all the time?
There are substantial surpluses that are built up in a number of seaters. I would not want to talk about siphoning off, but it's definitely the case that there are substantial surpluses that have been built up in a number of seaters and in the National Skills Fund, and the use of those surpluses is governed by law.
Well, that may be, but is there a use? Or is the pot simply getting fuller?
You want to try now?
You don't want to commit yourself.
So I wouldn't say the pot is getting fuller, but I would say there's a substantial surplus. So at the last estimate, it was in the order of 10 or 15 billion, somewhere around there.
Yes, but for whose good is all this being held?
I think, look, one of the issues that I think needs to be discussed in the context of the Commission is exactly the questions that you're raising, and whether we need to reconsider this arrangement.
Well,
our hesitation is that we don't have a firm answer. I mean, it's something that we discuss a lot, but we don't have a clear position as
I'm not sure how this falls into your responsibilities for the national budget as the Department of Finance. Do you stand looking at the seaters from the outside, or do you actually have an input?
So we don't have any control over the financial flows, in the sense that there's a National Skills Act, and that prescribes a 1% levy on payrolls. And that 1% levy, in terms of the Act, may only be used for certain purposes.
So you've got a tap that is permanently turned on?
You could say so.
Yes. And what about the plug at the bottom?
So, Chairperson, if I could go directly to slide 26.
Yeah.
It might not satisfy you.
Oh no,
but at the bottom of that slide, there's a section there addressing imbalances in earmarked taxes. Is one of the issues.
I'm not sure that we have the right slide here.
Let's see. On the screen, it looks like this.
What is the heading at the top, please?
Medium-term policy
Yes, that
tax
I have,
policy
yes.
consideration. So at the bottom there, the third kind of bold bullet
Addressing imbalances, yes.
in earmarked taxes.
Yeah.
And we make the point there that and this slide is addressing the things we think need to be addressed in reforming the tax system.
Yes.
As we go forward in addressing these problems. And we're saying that National Treasury remains concerned about the imbalances associated with earmarked taxes. And this is an example of an earmarked tax, because it doesn't go into the general pot of spending. It's prescribed that it must only go to a certain. So we then use the example that the accumulated surplus of the UIF, the Unemployment Insurance Fund, will increase from 123 billion to 175 billion over the medium term. So while we are having to cut the system somewhere, the UIF has this bath filling of a reserve. On the other hand, the Road Accident Fund, which is also funded directly by an earmarked tax, has a liability which is growing hugely every year, and now is estimated.
A very simple reason for that: they won't pay me. I can't get anything out of them. But there you are.
Yeah, no, that's.
I suppose they treat everybody the same way, and that's why.
No,
the
you're right.
liability
The reason they
continues to
can't pay
grow.
you is okay. Let me not say something
well,
I'll regret
anyway.
later.
Anyway, so you're
anyway,
saying
the last bullet then says this includes consideration of whether the skills development levy is the best way to support skills development, and whether these funds can also be used to increase access to post-school education. And what we're saying is that the National Skills Act prescribes the use of those funds for the skills training of the workforce. Now, it doesn't define what the workforce is, but any common definition of the workforce excludes students. So the question is, there's this resource coming from the skills development levy. There is a sense of surpluses building there. But also, let me add that the Department of Higher Education and Training has a very strong mandate coming from the National Development Plan to expand skills training, and wants to use this revenue source for that. all we're saying is that this should be part of the discussion that we're having. It's certainly an issue that needs to be interrogated.
Why has it
Chairperson,
been-
just to indicate that the question of the skills development levy is an issue which we'll be looking at very closely in set 2.
Thank you.
And we've already started engaging with the Department of Higher Education on
Thank you
that.
very much.
Okay. So let me just go back to some of the spending issues. This is another way of looking at spending. Now I'm on slide 19, which is looking at the whole budget. So the whole budget is about R1 trillion. You can then see that the wage bill is 516 billion rand each year. Goods and services, which includes things like medicines and textbooks, is 204 billion. Social benefits, which is mainly social grants, is about 191 billion. There's a little table there that breaks it down. And then capital spending and transfers is there.
So
Again,
when you say medicines and textbooks, what's that for? Are we not talking about the public service?
so goods and services in this context that are funded by the budget includes the textbooks we buy for schools.
I see.
Yeah, and the
understand.
medicines we buy for hospitals.
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, then if you look at the next graph, you can see the same picture, but now in terms of growth rates. So, over the next 3 years, again, as I've said, debt service costs are the fastest growing element of expenditure. Compensation of employees is the next fastest growing element of expenditure, there and thereafter. Maybe if I go, yeah, okay.
And the last one includes renewal of infrastructure, does it?
Yeah. So, yeah, it does. Now, the next table just shows some selected programs that, although we're in this process of constraining expenditure growth, there are a number of expenditure items that continue to grow rapidly relative to other spending items. And you can see in the first kind of panel, it's the education-related items. So, and this includes the provision for 0 fee increase last year. So you can see that community education and training, although it's only 1.5 billion in the first year, it grows by 15% over 3 years. NSFAS grows from 9.2 billion to 13.7 billion. That's a growth rate of 14.1%. That is probably the single, one of the, it's in the top 3 of rapid growth rates in the entire budget. And then university subsidies grow from 22.9 billion to 29.8 billion over the next few years, an annual growth rate of 9.1%. Other things that grow rapidly are HIV and AIDS medication, and other health, the employment programs, the kind of public works programs of government. And you see there at the bottom panel, the old age grant and the care dependency grant and the child support grant are also things that we try and keep the growth in line with inflation. But remember also the number of recipients is also expanding, so it's growing much faster than inflation. So with your permission, Chairperson, I'll go to the next section, which is on tax policy issues. And the first slide just shows you the overall breakdown of taxes that we receive in a year. This is last year's taxes. So personal income tax, which is on salaries, is 390 billion. Value-added tax, which we get from whenever you go into a shop or buy some durable goods in particular, is 278 billion. And company tax, which is on company profits, was 189 billion. And then there's some smaller taxes, the fuel levy, taxes on trade, and excise, which is what you pay on cigarettes and alcohol and so forth.
Just as again, as a matter of breakdown, taking personal income tax, what percentage of personal income tax comes from people of, say, over R1 million or over 800,000 rand? Is it possible to
in the Val, Vanderbiljlpark. Am I not shining, people?
The whole population, and you've broken it into 5.
And my powder is in there. What? My powder is in my thing there. Is it still a shrine?
Not too bad.
Fund. What is it? Vanderbiljl? Vanderbiljlpark. They say they're still not getting anything. Yes. Yeah, boy. Sure. Yep, I can hear you, Natasha. All right, sure, that sounds good. Do not show my Mkaba situation, eh? Oh, sure. But also I don't like it like when you zoom like my face too much.
No.
Just like,
It's up to where your hand is.
okay. That's good. Good afternoon to you, Natasha. And indeed, day 3 of the Fees Commission here in Vanderbiljlpark is about numbers and graphs and talking economics and just looking at issues of economic growth and how that will affect the funding for the education sector. And what the Treasury has said here, including what you mentioned in the intro, is that increased funding for the education sector would mean that there should be increases in taxes, and that's where the money would come from. Or it says that there would have to be reallocation of funds from other departments to be able to fund education, and saying that also they have spoken to government to try to sort of minimize their costs, especially talking about the issue of government staff, and saying that government needs to limit its staff intake, saying that government spending or on salaries of staff takes quite a huge chunk from the budget, and that going forward that needs to be taken care of. But maybe a sort of breaking news, if you can call it that, Treasury confirmed that they have not budgeted for another zero-fee increase following that of 2016. They said for going forward, they haven't budgeted on that. Probably then this tells us that when Minister of Education, Blade Nzimande, makes his announcement this afternoon, he will speak to the effect that there might be a certain increase. We don't know the percentage, but certainly Treasury has told us here at the Commission that they have not budgeted for any more zero-fee increment. Yes, that's quite true. The student, EFF Student Command was supposed to come through here and also give its inputs to the Commission. However, it told the Commission that it will no longer participate as it has no confidence in the processes of this Commission. Now, this is not the first group. We've had groups like PASMA, the Pan-Africanist Student Movements. We've had the South African Union of Students. They've also indicated their disappointment and that they don't have confidence in the Commission. And this all relates to the issue of 2017 fees. They wanted the Commission to make a pronouncement on what's going to happen in terms of 2017, and they've made it quite clear that they will not accept anything less than a zero-fee increment in 2017 as well. Now, this means it's going to be quite an interesting afternoon for the education sector, considering that Treasury has said to us that they have not budgeted for another zero-fee increment. Well, the Commission has to continue because part of its mandate is to not just look at the education sector at the immediate matter of 2017, but it has implications for the long term on going forward. How does the education sector get funded? And of course, there's the talk of that those who can afford must pay, and those who can't afford then need assistance. But then the question is, how do you determine who can afford and who can't afford? So there needs to be sort of set principles in place that will help guide going to the future. How do you separate who can afford and how much assistance those who can't afford need? So it has to continue. The inputs that this Commission is taking are not only from students, it's also from the education sector, business sector, political movements, and also ordinary members of the public. So it is continuing with its work, and these hearings are scheduled up until March next year. So it will continue taking inputs. Sure. I think that went on smoothly.
And wealthy individuals have ways of structuring their tax affairs to shift things into, say, Panama or whatever the latest tax haven is. There's no doubt that's the case. And this is a continuous struggle that tax authorities face, and there's not a simple solution to it. You can't simply impose a levy, because, as I say, it's like any law, and maybe I should fear to tread on legal issues, but ultimately you need the population to accept the law and the majority of people to accept that the thing is wrong. You can't rely on the brute force of coercion to get people to comply with laws.
So it comes back to your consent.
Yeah, it comes back to consent, or you need a balance. There will always be individuals that commit misdemeanors and try and avoid paying taxes. But overall, if you compare South Africa to, say, for example, Brazil, tax avoidance is a culture in Brazil, whereas tax compliance is a culture in South Africa. So the point I'm raising is that as you increase your taxation, you must be very careful to preserve that asset of compliance. And that has got a lot to do with taxation, but it also has a lot to do with the quality of spending. Because if people feel, if taxpayers feel that their money is being wasted in the course of taxation, it also will erode this question of tax morality. So we need to put taxation and spending on the agenda together and be responsible. Thirdly, we need to keep the system progressive and balanced. South Africa's tax system is highly progressive already, and compared to most other developing countries, it's one of the most progressive tax systems in the world. Well-targeted expenditure programs mean that tax revenue mainly benefits the poor through social protection, healthcare, education, and other public services. The balance between taxes on income, which I spoke to now, and consumption will be important to ensuring a diversified, efficient, and equitable tax system. The current tax system suggests that there's greater room to increase indirect taxes, such as VAT. Proposals along these lines would need to be accompanied by measures to improve the pro-poor character of expenditure so the fiscal system remains progressive. And we're not, again, our intention here is not to say things can't be done, but to present the trade-offs and consequences of actions. So if the chairperson asked a question earlier on about the comparative tax burden. Let me just skip to slide 28, which shows in the first column the overall tax to GDP ratio. So the highest number there is Sweden, 42%, extremely high tax to GDP ratio. South Africa has 25.7%. Remember in the graph I showed you at the beginning, we already have plans on the table to increase that to about 27%, just to close the current fiscal position.
Sure.
So that would take us up to more than Australia. Now, of course, South Africa is not as developed as Australia. We are a developing country. The only developing country that has a higher tax to GDP burden in that list, and of course this is a selective list, is Brazil.
Well, is Turkey not a developing country?
Turkey is a developing country, you could say, but it's next to Europe. It has a higher GDP, but you're right. It's probably about the same level as us. So, but if you look at, for example, African countries that are there, Kenya, Ghana, Rwanda, in general, our tax burden, I mean, there's not, some economists would argue that there's a right tax burden. I don't think that's the case. I think that, and it's a personal opinion, it all depends on what the social contract is in that society. So Sweden can sustain 42% tax to GDP ratio and still grow and function effectively as a society. Other countries can't do that. It depends on politics as much as economics. But then if I go to the separate columns, you can see that PIT, personal income tax, our highest marginal rate is 41%. Some are higher than us, some are lower than us, but we tend to be in the upper end of personal income tax range. Corporate income tax is 28%. Again, if you look there, we tend to be in the upper range of the rate of corporate tax. Spain is a bit higher. Britain has recently announced, or the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, after the Brexit vote, announced plans to reduce their corporate tax to 15%. And now Donald Trump, in fact the USA has one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world, but he has announced part of his platform is to reduce corporate tax to 15%. There's a big problem with corporate tax, and that is that, and people, and I'm raising it because I know in the context of this debate people often point to corporate tax as the answer. The difficulty is that it's not clear who pays corporate tax. This is because the statutory incidence of a tax is not the same as the economic incidence of a tax. So the law says corporates must pay corporate tax, it's clear, and they pay corporate tax. But if I raise the corporate tax rate, and so corporations now have to pay 30% instead of 28%, you have to consider what will be the impact of that, say, for example, on the retail sector. Woolworths, Pick n Pay, Checkers, etc. How will they respond to that tax increase? One way they could respond, and this is all hypothetical, I'm not attacking that sector, but one way they could respond is by increasing food prices by 2% on their shelves. Yeah. If they do that, it means the people paying the tax are consumers, not corporations. Yes. Alternatively, in the same sector, the unionization of the workforce tends to be quite weak. Because what you've done when you've raised the tax, you've reduced profits in that sector. Then the shareholders will say to the management, we're not prepared to accept that reduction in profits. We will remove our money from you to some other sector of the economy or overseas. So you better maintain our profit rate.
Well, it might have had the effect of reducing the dividend.
It might reduce the dividend. All I'm saying is, it's not necessarily the case that that will follow. Right. And companies have recourse to shift the burden of that taxation away from the dividend towards either consumers or towards the workers employed in that company, particularly if those workers are poorly unionized. And the outcome, so the economic incidence of the tax may differ from, so one needs to consider this. And again, I'm not saying therefore it mustn't happen, but we must consider this. Lastly, if you look at VAT.
Sorry, may I just ask a question? Would this also not depend on the growth of each sector? So you can't apply a uniform corporate tax. For example, what happens if the commodity sector has contracted, for example, so they're not making money, whereas another sector probably is, and you can say, well, they can probably pay more tax, corporate tax than a sector that's struggling. How do you deal with that?
So in general, there's a principle in taxation of equity. And in general, you want to avoid distortion. And distortion arises when you do the kind of thing that you're suggesting, and many people do this kind of thing. But in principle, you would want a flat rate for everybody who's the same type of person. So profits should be equally taxed across all sectors of the economy. So this rate applies 28% to every sector of the economy. What we do is we have then, say in the mining sector, you have something called an accelerated depreciation allowance, which means that the money you spend on investment in capital is, you can take that off your tax burden to a great, so you have kind of other, so the main tax rate is the same for everybody, but then you find if you need to support a particular sector, or let me take the auto sector, cars. The auto sector benefits from massive subsidies in the tax system that are kind of tax rebates they get. But it's better to, if you want to address the kind of problem that you're speaking of, to subsidize that sector explicitly rather than granting them a lower tax rate. That's generally how tax people would think about the problem.
Sorry, Mr. Sachs. Would it not be a certain percentage of profits? So whatever they're making,
is yes.
That the percentage?
Yes, so it's 28%, yes.
Okay.
So, okay, I'll come to the next graph next, but I just wanted to get to the VAT column and point out that of all of the countries in that list, we have the lowest VAT rate.
Well, apart from Canada, yes.
Apart from Canada, my apologies. Yeah, Canada. But then you look at the Canada makes up with a very high personal income tax rate. So this is why, again, this is not a foregone conclusion, but according to our analysis, when we look at the tax system and the balance of various evidence, we're of the view that the space that we see out there for shifting taxes is more on the VAT side than on the CI, the corporate or the personal
Might
income
I just ask, although I think I can do it in my own mind, but would you just quantify what would an increase of 2 cents in the rand in that mean by way of increased income?
So a 1% increase in VAT would generate about 15 billion rand a year. So the other factor to consider,
This would no doubt be swallowed up in next year's public service increase.
this is why I say the expenditure side has to be on the table again. The other principle to consider is the buoyancy of a tax over the economic cycle. So this shows the percentage of GDP from the main tax collections over time. The top line is personal income tax, so you can see that we collect about 8% of personal income tax from the economy over time. And you can see that it's been rising as a result of the policy interventions that I was speaking about before.
I'm sorry, I don't quite follow this. What do you mean you could... Oh, I see. 8% of GDP is
Yeah.
represented by personal
Yeah.
income tax, and it's rising, yes. Right.
Yeah. So that, when I said we collect 390 billion rand from personal income taxes, I'm dividing that number by total GDP,
Yes.
which is the total income from all different sources, just to give a common metric to each of these taxes.
And personal income tax doesn't include VAT for this
No.
purpose.
So VAT is also there. If you check the grey line, that's, I know that
Yes,
the
yes.
middle line, that's VAT. And then the red line is corporate income tax. And then the line at the bottom is customs duties. So it's just to give you a comparative sense on the same scale of how much we collect from each of these. Now the thing I wanted to point out here is that when we were hit by the crisis in 2009, immediately the corporate income tax collections fell off dramatically because immediately companies stopped making profits and many companies made losses. So the tax base contracted very sharply in the 2009 crisis, and corporate income tax has not really recovered since then. It remains at that lower level. We haven't dropped the tax rate, still 28%, and it's remained 28% throughout that period. But the collections have dropped significantly. Whereas personal income tax and VAT, you can also see the impact of the recession. So it's also more cyclical. So it's just a factor that one has to consider, that if you hinge the program on a tax source that is going to vary considerably like this over a cycle, it will open up problems. Let me go back to slide 25 or 26 to just say what are some of the other medium-term considerations. We then say ensuring a sustainable tax burden, and we're commenting on the graph that I've just shown you, that South Africa's tax burden is rising but currently sits roughly on the average between developing and developed economies. While corporate income taxes are relatively high, the VAT rate is relatively low, lower than in most other jurisdictions, especially those with high levels of social spending. The next point is protecting corporate income tax base, which is the issue that the chairperson raised just now in his remarks. So we say in recent years, greater attention has been paid to multinational companies that avoid or evade tax by shifting taxable income to low tax regimes or tax havens. Such practices reduce the corporate income tax base. Essentially, you're shifting profits, which is the tax base, and put domestic companies at a disadvantage. So whereas the multinational company can do this, a company that doesn't have a branch in another country is stuck in South Africa, so it's at a disadvantage.
How effective is our regime at preventing moving money offshore?
So it's a difficult question to answer. It's because how can I put this delicately? You need to know how much money has been moved offshore,
Sure,
which you
is
can
a
only
secret.
estimate.
Yes.
So I would say that it's certainly something that the Revenue Service has paid extensive attention to in the last 5 to 10 years.
And would you say they've been successful?
They have been successful, but it's the kind of thing where you will never be successful enough. It's impossible.
No, I understand.
No matter how successful you are, there's still room to be more successful.
Yes, right.
But important is the second point, that this is an international problem. That in essence you need a cooperation between South Africa and the tax authority in the country where the money is being shifted to. So South Africa is also in the forefront of engaging in international processes to address this. So you see the international response to the Panama Papers leak was we need to close down Panama as a tax haven, and all tax collectors have an interest in doing that. Also, increasingly, we're sharing information. So we require companies to report exactly on their activities wherever they're based in the world, and the tax authorities share that information between different people.
And I think generally through, I mean, we are a member of the G20, and in the last 5 or so years, base erosion and profit shifting has been an agenda in the G20 setup, and our participation in various fora around issues of financial, just generally the global financial architecture, membership of FATF, membership of various new regulatory frameworks, actually makes us part of the global family that aims to address this in terms of our own exchange of tax information between ourselves and other countries. That, in a way, slowly is getting us closing the gap quickly, because through a reform that has been recently introduced in the last 5 years or so, where sharing of tax information becomes or has become an issue that we've picked up, where we share information with other countries who are members of the financial FATF. I forgot the actual, but we are members. So
the Financial Action Task Force.
Financial Action Task Force. We sharing information has begun, and it has closed the gap. A good example is the Panama Papers, as Michael has said.
Just on that, like, are we signatories to maybe where those tax havens are on a treaty of some kind, or on that family, like, or they have an election not to be members or signatories, the tax haven countries?
Slowly, I mean, the Financial Action Task Force many countries, certainly within the G20 setup, we are members of all of these international fora. But the list changes every year, where some members come on board. There's certain criteria in terms of your systems, financial aid systems, financial systems. But there's some criteria, and if you don't meet the criteria, then you fall off the list, and then you become a focal point. For you to be accepted again, you must be lifted up. But I can answer you shortly to say, yes, we are members of all of these global fora that looks at this, because it's not only these issues, but it's also issues around money laundering, and tax avoidance, tax evasion, as Michael said, and then many other illicit flows that, and we're closing the gaps, and we're playing a major.
I was wondering if those countries that frown upon tax sharing, how they can be pulled in to that if they don't elect to be signatories.
It's an issue of international relations more than economics in some respects, that, you know, how do you do that? And you know, what you must also, I mean, there are those that argue, for example, that the UK includes within its jurisdictions tax havens, like Guernsey, and I don't want to be quoted attacking the UK on it, but I'm just saying there's that out there. Panama, what's its relationship with the US? So issues of international relations play a role in this, and our power as a small, relatively small economy is not necessarily, so you need international cooperation to address these issues. The last point I wanted to make on taxation is on this slide, which I won't go through the whole slide, but I just we point to the point, the last bullet point, that after a certain point, higher tax rates become counterproductive. Companies, for example, companies move to a different jurisdiction and can generate lower revenue. So there's a well-defined regularity where it's said when you reach a certain point of tax increases, people will, you may end up raising the tax rate but collecting less revenue. And not necessarily because of avoidance or illegal activities. That's one issue. But another issue is people change their behavior. If we were to, for example, continue ramping up taxes on petrol, eventually people would start consuming less petrol once you reach a certain point. And you could say that petrol, I mean, there's some, in economics, it's an elasticity. How dependent are people on petrol? But if I start massively increasing the tax on, I live in Johannesburg and I work in Pretoria. If the tax on petrol were to go up beyond a certain point, I may say, let me move to Pretoria, and therefore I can save on my petrol bill. So people's behavior changes, and you reach a point where the increase in the tax rate leads to less collection of taxation. So even on these issues of avoidance, probably the country that suffers from this factor the most, if you think which country in the world has the most multinational corporations that are capable of taking their money offshore, it's the USA, which also has one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world. So American companies store their cash outside the US, and it's a big problem for American policy makers. As I said earlier, Donald Trump's solution to this problem is to reduce the corporate tax rate from about 32% to 15%. Effectively, what he is saying is, I want to make the USA into a tax haven and have all countries from around the world come to the USA and pay low tax and create jobs there. So there is, again, the argument is not that you can't do it, you can't have higher tax rates. The argument is there are consequences, and let's understand what the consequences are before we go down that path. The last section of the presentation is about the budget process. And I will try and go as fast as I can through it without, but obviously still remaining open to all of your difficult questions.
Sorry, what page is this, the one?
Now I'm moving to slide
No, I'm saying
34.
the one that's on...
Oh, sorry, let me move that. This one that is on the screen is slide 27. On the... I don't know, Commissioner, if you found it, it's like, yeah, after the medium-term tax policy considerations.
Okay.
So I'm now going to slide, it's unnumbered, but it's 33, which just says, how do we engage in a budget process? And usually in the public discourse, National Treasury is depicted as this department that has enormous influence over the budget process. And I wouldn't deny that we do have a strong influence over the budget process. But the important thing to remember about the budget process is it is a collaborative process within government. And the final decision makers are political. We make recommendations to Cabinet, we make recommendations to a body called the Ministers' Committee on the Budget, but we are not the decision makers. The ultimate decision makers are Parliament. There's no money that can be appropriated and spent by government without the approval of a law in Parliament, and that law is called the Appropriation Act, which is passed by Parliament, and Parliament has the power in law, to change that act. There are many debates to be had, which are legitimate debates about how effective their ability to do so, whether they can effectively exercise that power. But the point I'm making is that the budget is a collaborative process about which we try and convene the discussions, have rational deliberations about the problems we face, and make sensible recommendations to the decision makers who are Cabinet and Parliament. There are three objectives that we try to promote. Fiscal sustainability, which I've spoken about at length. Effective allocation of resources, which means with the limited resources we have, which priorities do we allocate them to? And lastly, value for money, which is now you've decided to allocate the money to a particular use, are you wasting it in the execution of that intention? So we try and raise these three issues consistently in the process. We are constrained by this equation in slide 34. And it's a very simple equation, but it's one that people often miss. That expenditure equals revenue plus borrowing. There's no place where we can take money and allocate it to higher education. It must either come from without changing the expenditure side of the equation, which means you have to decrease expenditure somewhere else in the system. Or you have to get more revenue, which means that you have to raise taxes, or you have to borrow the money. Those are the only three ways we can allocate resources in the budget. If you try and avoid this equation, it will come back and find you one day.
If we invent a new way, we'll tell you.
If this commission could apply their mind to that, we would be very thankful.
Is that not the, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Because
Perhaps.
if you think about it, you already have certain expenditure items. And you are saying, in order to give money to a different item, you're going to have to take it away from somewhere.
Yeah.
But if that item wasn't there in the first place, hence the question of the chicken or the egg, which came first.
You're very right, Commissioner. One of the big problems in budgeting, and not only in South Africa but internationally, is what is called incrementalism. So we would all like a situation. The budget is R1 trillion. Budget is, which is 1,000 billion rand. We would all like a situation where we say, okay, what should we spend our money on next year? What should we spend this R1 trillion on next year? And we say, well, let's spend more on higher education and less on something else and more on the other. That would be zero-based budgeting. And many people have tried to give effect to this, but nobody has succeeded in the private and the public sector. Because what you have allocated last year, it's almost like you're locked into that in perpetuity. And it's very difficult to shift resources out of that responsibility. So when we were, maybe if I go back to right at the beginning of the presentation, and I was showing you an expansion of the budget year after year for 10 years. When we were in that situation, each year our revenue was overperforming on the previous year because growth was so high. So each year we would say, this is how much we're spending next year. But then when we arrive there, we find we've got 10 billion extra we can spend. And then the discussion is very nice. The discussion is, what should we spend this 10 billion rand on? Now the discussion is very painful. Because the discussion is, who is going to contribute to this 10 billion rand that is needed by somebody else, and where are you going to cut? And the issues of, so in this graph, when the red line was rising year after year, on average, every year, in the MTEF, we added 50 billion rand into the pot. And the budget process was about a discussion of how will we spend the new money. Should it go to health? Should it go to social grants, etc.? Now, when the line is flat, anything you want to do, you have to cut somewhere else. And we raise the issues of value for money. It's one of the most important issues we raise. We try and combat inefficiencies in the system and get people to do things more efficiently. We try and identify programs that it's our view that they're not performing. But the important thing to remember about budgeting is that anywhere you cut, there's a loser on the other side. So, for example, Mr. Mohojani was talking earlier about cost cutting. So one of the things people might say is cut catering budgets. Government is having these lavish lunches. And it's true, and it's something we have cut. But remember that there are small black-owned businesses that are providing catering to government. That is a business for them. And when you cut that catering budget, they lose from that cut. So there's no cut that you can conceive of in the system that won't have a counter-argument, that people will come and say, but you say we're trying to promote small business, and by cutting this catering budget, you're undermining small business, therefore don't cut the catering budget. So anything we do ultimately requires a political commitment that we will make this cut, and it's not an easy process to engage on.
Can I ask you about a slightly different thing? Unspent allocations in budgets.
So
what does this represent annually?
It's declining, but last year I think we had underspending against the final budget of about 6 billion rand.
Now, is that simply built into the next budget? Or what happens to carry it? How is that carried forward?
In general, that will reduce the amount of borrowing we need to make in the year. So it won't be carried through onto the next budget. It will mean that our total spending level is less than we would have thought of in the year than we budgeted for. And because the total remember that the spending is here and the revenue is here. Now it means your spending is a bit lower.
Now, is that reflected in your next budget? Or is
It's
it
not
just
carried
is
through
it
into
just
the
a
next
windfall?
budget. Yeah, it's not carried through into the next
It's
budget.
a windfall.
It's a less of a, so we're borrowing the money. So it means we have to borrow less, which is a type of windfall. But it's not like the money is sitting somewhere. It just means that we have to borrow less in the course
Now,
of the year.
recently I had cause to ask what is happening with certain people in a certain department, and I was told, oh, they're doing something or another. And I said, how can this be? And they said, oh, well, you know, there's a budget to be spent.
So often another problem we have with budgeting is that towards the end of the year, many departments and agencies will see that so they make budget bids, and then during the course of the year they're unable to spend the money. So often, and I mean it's especially with new programs, when you ramp up spending on a program very rapidly, people believe they think it's easy to spend R1 billion, and it's actually not that easy.
But nearer the end of the year, it gets a lot easier.
So for example, and Julia was the one. There was a decision taken in government at a certain point that no children should be left under a tree for school. Very good decision, nothing wrong with that. And it was said, let's create a new grant to build schools. And we created a new grant to build schools, and in the first year we had how much allocated? So in the first year we allocated what, 4 billion? So in the first year we allocated 700 million, but the Department of Basic Education could only spend 10 million. So sometimes, and what this illustrates is that sometimes people say the constraint is the budget, but they don't realize that actually simply allocating money to a problem doesn't always solve the problem.
Doesn't this indicate a great deal of inefficiency?
Well, in this case that I'm talking about, it indicates over-optimism about the capacity to set up a new program and spend the money. So over time, 3 or 4 years later, they did ramp up the spending. So there you have to contract with construction companies to build the schools and so forth, and they were over-optimistic about their capacity as a department to roll out the program.
The over-allocation, the 5 billion or whatever it is, at the present, in the present budget, or the previous
The
year
6 billion last year.
Yeah. Now, is this a standard thing? How much does it vary from year to year?
It's getting, as the fiscal constraints are beginning to bite, it's getting smaller. That's the one point I would make. You know, the difficulty we have is that the system punishes overspending. So the Public Finance Management Act makes it illegal for you to overspend on your budget.
I understand.
But there's not a similar punishment for underspending.
I understand.
So it's kind of biased, it's asymmetrical.
No, but what you're saying suggests to me that in any given year, you've got anything up to 5 or 6 billion rand, which is lying around waiting to be used.
Let me come at it from a different angle. As I indicated in an earlier slide, our revenue collection was 11 billion rand lower than we forecast.
I thought that the revenue collection was so very good, but anyway.
So the revenue collection depends on the economic growth.
Yes, I see.
So when we revise the growth, so we are estimating in February, we have to estimate what 300 departments across national and provincial government and 300 public entities will spend in a trillion rand budget, 1,000 billion. And we're out by 6. So it's like you budget for 1,000 rand and you spend 994 rand and you're left with change of 6. It's not, from where we're sitting, it's not too bad.
If you're earning 1,000 rand a month, then the 6 rand would be quite valuable.
It would be quite valuable, but then you also find that you were expecting to earn 1,000 rand, but you only earn 500 rand. So you're right, it would be valuable, but actually it's a benefit that you didn't spend the whole money because your revenue has fallen much faster than your spending. So at the end of last year, we were 10 billion lower than what we said we would collect in revenue, and we were 6 billion lower than what we said we would spend. The other element in this that people often don't appreciate is that we have an adjustment budget. So we sit in February and we estimate what we will spend in the year. Then we come in October and we adjust those estimates. And usually what will happen is a program will adjust the estimate upwards. So you thought you were going to spend 100 Rand. Then you look at your spending program through the year and you say, I think we're going to be short of money by the end of the year. And because the PFMA makes it illegal to overspend, I would like to adjust my budget up from 100 Rand to 150 Rand. Then at the end of the year, you only spend 130. So you've underspent against the adjusted budget, but you've spent more than what you said you would originally spend. So that 6 billion Rand is against the adjusted budget. And in previous years, the adjusted budget would be higher than the original budget.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, so
Thanks.
the next slide looks at medium-term budgeting, and the basic point is that we have a 3-year window that we budget over, and we roll and we update over the years. In recent years, we've made those limits much stronger, hard limits, which means that they're much more rigid in the future years. I won't go into this, I don't know what to call it, spiderweb diagram, but it's just trying to convey some of the complexity of the issues that we have to process through each annual budget. From the economic forecast, it feeds into the fiscal framework where you have that equation of revenue, the deficit, revenue plus borrowing equals spending. You also have to update the wage bill forecast in terms of the inflation forecast, update all of your expenditure projections for the next 3 years, and then you would consider policy priorities and how these would feed into the system. We also have to budget in 4 dimensions. So there's functional budgeting, which is how do we divide the trillion Rand between the different policy objectives. But if I allocate money to education, let's say here we're talking about basic education. 80% of basic education spending is the salaries of teachers. So if I allocate more money to basic education, it also means I must allocate more money to compensation of employees, which is the next block, the economic classification. Also, basic education is delivered in provinces. So if I allocate more money to basic education, I must shift money from national to provincial government. And lastly, basic education is delivered by departments. So it means I must allocate to the departments of basic education. On the other hand, let's say I allocate additional money to higher education. Higher education is funded through a transfer to universities. In other words, we don't provide salaries directly, we transfer to universities and NSFAS. So it means in the economic classification, the transfers and subsidies will go up. In the intergovernmental classification, it's a national function. So it means money will be more national than provincial. And in the consolidated budget, what I'd be saying is that it would go to agencies and entities such as universities, not to government departments, because it goes to the department, but then it goes out to the agencies. So just to give you a sense of all of these things have to be considered together.
Sorry, just on that, would councils not be appropriate for varsities? Because I think there was a suggestion that it's controlled by councils. There'll still be agencies.
You mean university councils? Yeah, so you're probably, personally, I'm less in touch with that. I don't know, Julia, if you want to say anything about that. Yeah, so from our point of view, I'm not sure. It would go to we transfer to the Department of Higher Education, and then the Department of Higher Education transfers to the university administrations, which are governed by councils, who obviously would take that as part of their income. And as you know, they would have other sources of income, and this would be one stream of income for them. The role players in the budget, I suppose the 3 big role players, or the 2 big role players, let me put, it's the executive, and the legislatures. So it starts in the executive, and National Treasury convenes the executive's budget preparation at national level. So we have a medium-term expenditure committee. So people like Julia, our chief directors, will sit with individual departments, looking at their budget pressures and their budget issues, and prepare a report. And that report, after extensive discussion, will go to the medium-term expenditure committee. That's a committee comprised of the Director General of National Treasury, the Director General of the Department of Performance Monitoring and Evaluation in the Presidency, the Director General of the Department of Cooperative Governance, and the Director General of the Department of Public Service and Administration, and other officials. But it's those four key, what we call center of government departments, that then constitute a committee that would consider the proposals arising from each of the different groups. That committee then makes recommendations to the Ministers' Committee on the Budget. The Ministers' Committee of the Budget is chaired by the Minister of Finance. It includes the Minister of Public Enterprises, the Minister of Cooperative Governance, the Minister of Public Service and Administration, the Minister of Performance Monitoring and Evaluation. It includes the chair of the social cluster within government, who happens to be the Minister of Social Development, the Minister of the Economic Cluster, the chair of the Economic Cluster. It includes several other ministers. So there's about 10 ministers, key ministers within cabinet that form the Ministers' Committee on the Budget. So all the recommendations from this committee of officials, the MTEC, then get taken to the Ministers' Committee on the Budget. Then if they agree with the recommendations, those recommendations are then tabled in cabinet. And there are two types of recommendations that we need to table in cabinet. The one is the appropriation. So we go with the fiscal framework. We say, this is what we propose, the spending limit, these are our revenue estimates, this is our economic forecast, this is the fiscal outlook. Then these are the appropriations act, or the appropriations bill we want to table. So this is what we're allocating to individual departments. But there's another important constitutional instrument, which is the division of revenue. So how do you allocate the revenue between national, provincial, and local? And when we present that, we have to go to extended cabinet, which is cabinet plus the premiers of every province, plus some representatives of local government. So those are the role players. Of course, in the division of revenue, there are all kinds of structures set up to govern the fiscal relations between national, province, and local, including the Financial and Fiscal Commission and other statutory bodies. And then, of course, once the executive has completed its work, it tables the budget in the legislature, which in our case is Parliament, but in provinces, they also table their own budgets in provincial legislatures. So the next slide just sets out how a typical department would prepare its budget submission, which I will suggest that I will skip over unless there's any questions. We then look at the executive budget cycle, which I think covers the ground that I've already covered, except in a slightly more detail. The next slide talks about the parliamentary process. And there it's important to understand this relationship between the medium-term budget policy statement, which we table in October, and the actual budget. And this comes back to why last year was such a difficult year, because we go in October and we say, this is our economic forecast, these are our spending priorities, these are all of the elements in broad terms, in broad brushstrokes. This is what we think should be in the budget for the next 3 years. And we table that in October. And the idea is that Parliament should debate that. And Parliament will prepare a report on the fiscal framework, a report on the proposed division of revenue, a report on the appropriations proposed in the medium term. And those reports, we then have to consider them when preparing the main budget, which will come through in February. So when we have something knocks us off course, where we prepared our medium-term budget policy statement, then we, in November, December, have a zero fee increase, which we haven't considered, it becomes a bit complicated for us. And as I said, there's a Money Bills Amendment Procedure Act which empowers, the Constitution says Parliament is allowed to amend the budget, and national legislation must provide for the process through which that happens. That national legislation is in place, Parliament is allowed to amend the budget. So far they have not done so, but maybe if they present here, you can engage with them. And then the last slide speaks to the role of National Treasury, which is to propose the fiscal framework and the macroeconomic forecast, to propose the division of revenue between three spheres of government, to provide technical guidelines, so we set out how should budget submissions look like, to conduct an evaluation of budget submissions, to ensure that submissions reflect government priorities, to maintain ongoing communications with other central government departments, to make recommendations to the MTEC, the Budget Council. The Budget Council is an intergovernmental forum. The Ministers' Committee on the Budget, to in turn make recommendations to Cabinet and extended Cabinet, and to convene, so we...
Okay, sure. All right. Crap, this is going to be a long one because the department is now cancelled. It's the announcement on fees. Yeah, it's postponed. They know Wuti is over. If they announce a zero fee right now, it's gonna go down. It's 5 minutes to go, miss. Yo, I can't be standing here for 5 minutes. Yo.
And if there's a surplus, the people concerned will keep the surplus and prevent you from touching it, which is the case exactly that we have in respect of, so that we were discussing earlier.
we're just going to rehash what we spoke about, basically the news that they have not budgeted for it. The only new thing is that they're saying that, it's not a final decision, the fact that they have not budgeted for it, that the final decision in terms of fees will be taken by government. So, yeah. Sure. All right. Is that for me? Are they finishing? Crap-ish, now this. Good afternoon to you, Natasha. Yes, indeed. The big is this entire morning, actually, from the morning till this afternoon, has been the Treasury giving a very detailed report into the Fees Commission. And the big takeout from that is the fact that they've confirmed that as the Treasury, they have not budgeted for a 2017 fee increase. And now this is a very hot potato situation in the country, because you remember that the students are calling for another zero fee increase for 2017, and we were expecting the Education Minister to make an announcement on this matter, but now unconfirmed reports suggest that the Minister has postponed this announcement on fees, which tells you that it is still a very delicate matter that the department has to deal with. And Treasury mentions that, increasing education funding would mean that they have to increase revenue. That means, one, increasing revenue, that would mean then increasing the taxes. Or if that is not the option, then they would have to cut elsewhere. But the question is, who must lose? And another third option that they've mentioned to us is that they would have to borrow, but borrowing is not desirable, especially with a sluggish economy that's growing at 2%. So it is really a tough balancing act, and at this point in time, the Treasury says they have no budget for a zero fee increment for 2017. Well, the Commission is continuing with its work as has been happening since it started 2 days ago. This is now day 3 here in Vanderbiljlpark. And it says that despite the students not coming through, there are other sectors or stakeholders that are involved in this, like the Treasury, that they will accept submissions for. Even though the students are not here physically, it says that they had they had put forward written submissions. So they will take those written submissions into consideration moving forward. But you're right, the students are sticking with a zero fee increment for 2017, and we understand that the minister was supposed to make an announcement of this, so it is quite interesting now that we're getting reports that it will no longer do so, announce on the 2017 fees, that it will continue to consult on the matter. Well, for the rest of the day, the student groups have pulled out, so we have other stakeholders that will be coming through, also giving in their takes. We understand that, we are still, of course, right now with Treasury. They've just wrapped up their presentation here. But Treasury, one of the things that they've mentioned here, they've told us that, their findings that they do not have the final say onto the matter, that they make recommendations to Cabinet, and Cabinet and Parliament will take the ultimate decision. So we will await then to hear what the Department of Education has to say in terms of 2017. But the Commission in itself, it says that it's not looking at the immediate future, but rather at the long term of the situation concerning higher education fees in the country. Okay, can come through.
Sorry, you didn't leave me alive.
So who am I talking to?
To everyone.
It's just like
But where must he look? Do you want him to stand in the middle?
Yeah.
And then which way does he look?
He just looks straight. Yeah. So we'll just have someone here.
Somewhere in the middle. Let me stand a little bit to this side then. Do you want to stand in the middle?
Okay.
But then just look at the one person, regardless of who asks.
who must I look at?
Me.
Okay, what's
Just
your
pretty
name?
face.
C4.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you understand?
You haven't been fired yet.
No. We don't
Is he
fire
okay?
people. Eh?
Am I in your shot?
With your phone, yeah, your phone is in the shot.
Can I swap with you?
Thank you.
No, it's fine. My head. Oh, God. How is this going to work?
TV, guys, sorry.
For me also, I also need the visuals.
Now, good, rolling.
All right, Mr. Sachs, I think the question on everyone's lips is, can we afford free tertiary education?
I would say the answer is that we have to have a discussion about that question, because the question is not can we or can't we, but what are the consequences of investing in free tertiary education. If we were to do so, we wouldn't be able to do so without there being consequences. So you would either need to raise the resources from additional taxation, or you would need to reallocate spending from some other area of government priority. It wouldn't make sense for us to borrow money to fund free education. And this is beside the point about whether the country determines that this is the path they want to go down. But as a democratic society, if we determine that we want to go down this path of free education, we would then say, we can fund it by raising taxes. What are the consequences of those tax increases for households, for consumers, for citizens? How should we distribute those taxes across the population in a way that doesn't undermine economic growth, that ensures we're able to sustain our revenue base over a long term, so that we're able to keep this rising floor of social and economic rights that we have achieved over the last 20 years? On the other hand, if we didn't want to raise taxes, we could reallocate resources from elsewhere within the spending system. There are many factors in the budget where there can be efficiency gains, where we can combat waste in the system. But the truth is that the size of the investment that is being proposed is so large that it's unlikely that you would get enough money simply from improving efficiency. You would need to make a choice that there's something that we are spending money on now which is significant that we no longer need to spend that money on, and we would want to reallocate it. So at the end of the day, we're a democratic society. We make choices about how we allocate our resources. And the bottom line from our point of view is that it must either come from tax revenue or from reallocation within the budget.
Talk to us about 2017. You mentioned that you had not budgeted for another zero fee increase going forward. Can you talk to us about
Can
that?
I add on to his question in a sense that can you just run us through how you managed to do it for this year, how much it cost? You gave the numbers earlier, but just wrap that up for us, the cost of changing this around.
Also, just to substantiate on what she said, because you had to come up with that money, how did it impact on the running of the country or in any way?
So when the decision was taken last year to have a zero fee increase for all universities, obviously we were already at an advanced stage of preparing the budget that we announced in February. And we hadn't planned that there should be a zero fee increase. We had assumed that the university transfers would be the same. But when the zero fee increase was announced, we were then faced with a situation and a discussion between government and the universities of how will we fill this gap that results. And we estimated that the gap over the next 3 years would be 16 billion rand. So we had to allocate money from other priorities within the system to find that 16 billion rand. There were reductions to budgets for compensation of national departments. There were reductions to budgets going towards services delivered by provinces. There were reductions to local government budgets in order to fund that 16 billion rand. We also tried to intensify our efficiency improvements and cost containment measures so that those budget reductions would have less of an impact on service delivery. That's what we tried to achieve. But the truth is that it's when you have an unplanned spending requirement within the system, it's very difficult to deliver those funds without having some disruptive effect on government operations in the system. So as far as the position we were then in is a zero fee increase was agreed then. Certainly, we haven't budgeted now for this to continue and for there to be no fee increases. We've budgeted on the basis that we will return to the situation of normal fee increases. But of course, we remain, seized with the issue, and we will be prepared to respond to changes if they're there. Although it would be much better if there was a social agreement about how to move forward on this, so that we don't end up compromising other important government functions, because we deliver social grants, we deliver healthcare, we deliver basic education, and as I've said, all of these things in the system have to be financed either by shifting resources from those priorities or by taxation. And if we all understand that, I'm sure that all of us can reach an agreement on how to proceed on this one.
In the end, the President, once he receives the report from the Commission, will have to determine whether South Africa gets free tertiary education. And I would assume that as Treasury, you are central to the Commission coming up with that decision on their recommendations to the President. What is the message that you are giving to this Commission? Are you saying should we go for it? Granted, the conditions or the circumstances that we find ourselves under, as you have just outlined, we understand them. But what are you saying?
Our basic message is that we are a democratic society, and in a democratic society, choices have to be made. And the importance of that is not that we are free to make any choices we want to. But when we make choices as South Africans, we must be prepared to accept the consequences of those choices. So if South Africans are prepared to accept the consequences of a particular choice, there's no reason why that choice can't be made. What we should avoid is creating an impression that choices can be made without accepting the consequences. So we only have the good side, and we don't deal with the problems that are created. So that is our basic message to the Commission, that the Commission needs to carefully consider whether this investment, how it should be structured. I think everybody agrees in the country that Investing in higher education is an important thing. Whether fees should be free for everybody or for the working class and the poor or for different categories of people, and all of those issues are under discussion. Once we reach a conclusion of this debate as a democracy, we will make a choice, and that choice will come with consequences, and we will have to live with those consequences over a long period of time.
Thank you.
Just final that you said the current framework stands at about.
Yes, I have questions for economics that we need to do. I have questions for economics that
With him.
Every year,
just hold him. I need to take it there.
roughly 160 billion rand in debt service costs, which is like the interest payment on debt. So when you borrow, when you buy a car, you have the value of car and then the value of interest. So as a government, we pay about 160 billion rand a year. And if you think about it, that's almost the same amount that we spend on policing in the country. So it's a huge amount that we pay in interest, and certainly that's why it doesn't make sense to fund something like an expansion of tertiary education by borrowing. You would want to fund it either by tax revenue or by shifting from other resources.
Just to ask, you mentioned that to compensate for the announcement last year, which was 0% increase, certain movements have been made. Can you give us some examples of where money had to be? From what departments, from police, from some grants, where did the money come from?
And on that question, I think I heard you talking that you managed to get 16 billion on a 3-year period. But the question, when it came now, it is as if for this financial year, you didn't make any allocation for the 0% increase.
So our budget works in a 3-year rolling framework. So we budget for 3 years ahead. So when you have a 0 fee increase, that has consequences not only for this year, but it means for the next 2 years, in fact forever, the base of fees in universities will be lower. So we've compensated the universities on our budget for 3 years, for the 1 year 0% increase. We haven't budgeted, we can't now budget on the basis that there will be 0% fee increases in perpetuity. That would not be a rational basis, because that is not anybody's, well, that's not government's intention. So we're not budgeting on that basis. We're budgeting on the basis that there will be fee increases going ahead until we've reached a conclusion about how to reform policy if that's necessary in the sector. In terms of where did we shift money from into the higher education sector, as I've indicated, we have been accelerating our cost containment and trying to improve efficiency. But money was shifted from all national government departments had a reduction in their allocations over the next 3 years in order to finance this higher education spending. Provincial governments had some reduction in their allocations. That included allocations for what we call the equitable share, which is the general pot of money that provinces get, which goes into functions like basic education and health. We also reduced the grants that we give provinces to build infrastructure to some extent, and we did the same at local government level. So it wasn't concentrated on any one department or function, it was a broad-based reduction of spending across the system.
And Minister Nzimande was supposed to make an announcement this afternoon regarding the fees. We weren't sure exactly what the extent it was going to be. That has now been postponed. But something that one of the youth unions brought up on the first day was that they're concerned about how long this is going to take in terms of planning for next year's students, for those guys. So how do you think that's going to reconcile if the government comes out right now and says, okay, nothing, no increase, or an increase, we might see people being very upset about that, but if there's another year of no increases, how would you deal with that? And do you think that the time gap that we might have between the Commission and the beginning of the new year and everyone having to make budgets and having to plan, how is that going to work?
I'm not sure what your question is.
Do you think there's going to be a crisis with the time gap between the Commission and the new year coming? And what happens if they say to you tomorrow, say you made the announcement this afternoon to say there's a 0% increase?
If there was a 0% increase again this year, it would be disruptive of the budget system. We would have to find resources within the system that would certainly have an impact on government operations somewhere throughout. And so we don't think that that is a good way to proceed towards a better access to higher education. So we think a better way to proceed is have a commission. Let's deliberate on how are we going to achieve, what we want to achieve, and then deliberate on how are we going to achieve it, and then design a program to implement that. We think that's the best way to go about it. Zero, it's like, it has all kinds of consequences that I think even the students that are proposing zero fee increases need to consider, such as a zero fee increase benefits wealthy students equally as it benefits poorer students. So it's not a progressive way of approaching the problem in my view, and I hope that that's not what happens. Thanks very much.
Thank you so
Okay,
much.
thank you. Sorry, I just have to hold you one more time. The economics, I know you did this, but I'm just doing it for my other colleagues here who do an economics job. All right. Okay. Tell me, we're good to go? Okay. This might be a bit of repetition, but I understand that it's a separate show altogether. How is the National Treasury going to finance free education?
I think it's premature to answer that question because we don't know what exactly is to be financed, and we don't know what the quantity we're talking about is exactly. The recommendations that emerge from the Commission will define how we approach that question. The important thing, I think, for all of us to realize in the debate is that however we finance it, there will be consequences. And those, it won't be free for South Africa. It might be free for the students who receive the education, but for the country it won't be free. There will be consequences. Either you will have to raise taxes in one form or another, so you will have to raise the money from citizens and consumers and South Africans, or you will have to shift spending from somewhere else within the system. So you will have to say that some other service that we're providing as government needs to be scaled down in order to shift the resources into this requirement. Either of those choices, there are consequences. We certainly need to improve the efficiency with which government operates, and we are doing quite a lot to try and achieve that. But the size of the challenge that is being proposed is beyond what can be achieved through simple efficiency gains. You will have to make real resource allocation choices, and those choices will have consequences.
Okay, you've answered some of the questions they've asked here, so I'm just going to jump to the last one. Are you going to make adjustments to the midterm budget to make a provision for, no fee increases? At this stage, we are budgeting on the assumption that there will be fee increases as per usual, and that last year was a once-off event. So that's the basis on which we're budgeting. We don't announce our medium-term budget before we announce our medium-term budget. So when we announce our medium-term budget, we will answer the question more precisely. Okay, and just very lastly, just as we were talking with some of our colleagues, you mentioned that a zero-fee increment does not just benefit the poor alone. Can you just talk to us about that? So when we talk about a progressive taxation, for example, we say that a progressive taxation means the wealthier you are, the higher proportion you pay towards a tax. Now, a zero-fee increase essentially means fees are frozen equally for the wealthy and for the poor. And so it's kind of equal across the board, and wealthy students will also have a benefit from a zero-fee increase. And one has to ask, is that the best way of implementing a progressive strategy that improves access and affordability for the poorest students? And my answer would be no, it's not the best way. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay.